Born in Greenville, Mississippi, Shelby Foote's first novel, Tournament, was published in 1949 when he was 33 years old. He published 4 other novels in the 1950s. In the spring of 1954, Bennett Cerf of Random House asked him to write a brief account of the Civil War for the 100th anniversary of that conflict. 20 years later, in the spring of 1974, he completed The Civil War, A Narrative. Containing over 1 million words, the trilogy has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. From his home in Memphis, Tennessee, our guest for 3 hours today on In Depth is novelist and historian Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote, when did you move into this house, and how much of your Civil War writings were done from here?
All 3 volumes were written in Memphis. We lived down on the bluff overlooking the river for the first volume. Then we moved out to what was then the eastern city limits. I wrote the second volume. Then we moved back to a midpoint right in the middle of Memphis for the third volume.
How many years have you lived here?
We've been in this house since '66, so you can do the arithmetic.
How much, and what room are we standing in, and how much of the house plays in how you write and how you think?
Very much so, it always has. I've never been able to write away from home. My desk is where I do my work, and I don't write while I'm traveling or anything else. I have great admiration for writers like D.H. Lawrence and John Keats, who could write at any time, anywhere. But I could never do that always. If I take off 2 days, it'll take me 4 days to get back to work, and I have to be at my own desk. It's a laming thing.
Where are we in your house?
This is a sitting room adjoining my workroom here. The bedroom's on beyond it there.
You know, most of us got to know you in 1990 or thereabouts when Ken Burns did his Civil War epic of 11 episodes. Where were those interviews done?
They were done on this couch here, sitting right here in this room.
What impact did that whole series have on your life?
A tremendous impact. I had not realized the enormous power of television until that time. Not only to sell books, but to people think you've been in their homes. They will call you up, call you by your first name, and say it was very nice to have you in their house last week. It's kind of strange, and it's somewhat startling. Yeah.
We're going to chat for 3 hours. Our audience is going to get involved in about a half hour with their phone calls and the emails. But for someone who just might be happening on this program, never seen you before,
Right.
How much in your life have you written?
You mean how long have I been writing?
No, how many, how many words, how many books?
The Civil War is 1.5 million words, and the rest of my writing is about that same amount. So I've written something over 2 million words.
How many books total?
There are 6 novels in the 3 volumes of the Civil War, and then recently some things I've been doing for the Modern Library, like a long essay on Chekhov, another on Stephen Crane, favorites of mine.
We opened up by saying you're from Greenville, Mississippi. How many years do you live in Mississippi?
I lived in Mississippi until I moved here. Except for school and the Army, I was always in Greenville for the first 40 years of my life.
What impact did Mississippi have on you?
A great impact. One thing that happened, I know everybody thinks they had either the worst possible childhood or the best possible childhood. I was raised in a town in the Mississippi Delta, Greenville, and there was a population then of about 15,000, which meant that every child in that town between the ages of, say, 13 and 17 was in that school. So you lived the rest of your lives with people you'd been to school with during an impressionable time of your life. And I got to know every type of person it could be. And in a town that size, one of your best friends can be the son of the president of the bank. The other best friend can be the son of almost anything. And it gets you to know, it's sort of like the Army in that regard. You get to know all kinds of people and know them well.
Just a short distance here, you can get on the bridge and drive to Arkansas. How far are we from Mississippi?
Mississippi's about 14 miles south of here. Memphis is the capital of the Mississippi Delta, even though it's outside it.
I found something on the web that I wanted to share with you. This was from, I'm not going to give the student's name because it might be a tad bit embarrassing, but it was a a student, I believe, from Austin Peay State University in Tennessee. Have you heard about this?
No.
And she wrote an introduction and a biography about you.
Good.
But the last line of the opening says, Foote is a tremendous writer who served in the Civil War, and his writings come from his personal experiences.
I'm glad she got that impression. That's the impression I wanted to. I'm in that book, you see, I hope. And that's the way I think history should be written, as if you were living in that time. It's totally unfair to look at it from 150-odd years later and pass judgment on what those people did without knowing what their values were and what the laws were even. It's what causes an awful lot of misunderstanding, trying to apply a different set of standards to a different nation, really.
All right, you have how many books, do you think, in this house? And I know you got a bunch back here. I just want to ask you what's on that shelf.
There are books up this way, books this way, books that way. I'd be guessing if I said around 8,000 books, perhaps.
What's on that shelf that's one of your favorites?
Well, I have a particular reason for having a favorite. They're all my favorites. But up on the next to top shelf there's a leather-bound, that's the New York edition of Henry James. It belonged to Walker Percy. On the right over there, on the third shelf from the top, is a limited edition Club Shakespeare. That was my favorite possession. And the James was perhaps Walker's favorite impression. And about 20 years ago, we got to talking, and we agreed that whichever one of us died first, Walker would leave me the James, or I would leave him the Shakespeare. And he lost the contest, and I won it. That's Walker's James, that he, while he was on his deathbed, he told his wife to make sure I got it.
How many years ago did Walker Percy die?
He died in 1990.
And that Shakespeare over there, have you read all that?
Oh, many times, I guess, yeah. Shakespeare, you can't read too much Shakespeare.
Why?
Because the beauty of the language and the skill with which he handles it. The language itself, Shakespeare. He hung the moon. When you get to talking about art and writing, Shakespeare is outside any calculations. And in music, it's Mozart. And you put those two people off to themselves, and then you talk about various other people, but they hung the moon.
We're going to go in your next room in here. What is it?
I'm sorry?
That room. What's that room?
Well, that's where I do my work. That's my workroom. It always has been ever since we moved in. I had the desk built in, the bookshelves were built in.
Since 1967?
Yeah, 66. Mm-hmm.
Let's go in and see what we can find in here. Go ahead. Now, when you were writing, did you sleep in this room?
Seldom. Sometimes when I was very anxious to get to bed or get up in a hurry and I was working hard, I would sleep in here mostly, except right now.
Before we talk about anything, right on this bed is your life behind you.
It's very strange to see it laid out like that. I've never seen it that way before. I get the impression I somehow managed to swallow a cannonball. So it's very strange to see it all together there.
What's the first one over here, The Merchant of Bristol?
This is the first thing I ever published. A friend of mine at the newspaper in Greenville ran a linotype machine, so he did that for me. I bought the paper, the people put it together, and it's signed and numbered. There were, I think, 260 copies, and I charged $1.50 a piece for them. And the whole town was furious that I could put such a high price on such a junky little thing. It's worth a good deal of money now.
Now, Tournament was your first novel.
That's my first novel.
When did you start it? When did you finish it?
I started it the first 2 years at Chapel Hill. I decided I'd had enough college and it was time for me to come home because I knew the war was coming. This is like 38 or 9. And I came home, and while I was waiting, I joined the Mississippi National Guard, and while I was waiting for us to be mobilized, I wrote Tournament. And I sent it to Will Percy's publisher, Knopf, and they read it and wrote to me and said they liked it very much, but they didn't think it would sell, and I would do best to go on and write my next novel. and they'd be happy to see that. But they thought this would give me a bad name with booksellers. So I put it away in the drawer. When I came back from the war 5 years later, I got it out and revised it and sent it off, and it was published by Dial Press.
And the main message in the book?
It's a study of how each of us is alone in this world. It's a study of a man's rise and fall without his being able to answer that question. Chekhov, they say of him, he was not interested in the answers to questions. He was interested in stating the question well. I feel the same way about it.
How alone do you think you've been in your life?
It's hard to say. I don't know how to put time things. How do you mean, though?
Well, I mean, you say each man is alone. I mean, do you feel alone?
I think that each of us is alone. Being alone is something that you prize highly. To be alone is a good thing. But breaking out of it is something else. We are alone in strange times. You're most alone during nausea, for instance. You're also most alone, perhaps, during orgasm. This loneliness thing is a thing that can go on forever. They're little islands of quiet in the middle of the racket of a noise. It's a very strange business when you start examining how each man is alone.
And just a few months ago, you had a bout with cancer.
Right.
Colon cancer. What was that like?
You take medical things as they come, and you leave it up to the doctors to do something about it, and you do what the doctor says. I've had all kind of medical things since I turned 65. Lord, I've had a stent installed. I had one of the first balloon bypass heart things, and each one of those came along, and you just take it as that's the hand you drew at that time, and you leave it up to the doctors. And thank God I've had real good doctors, or I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here if they hadn't developed medicine as far as they have in the last 20 years.
Now, you're going to be 85 in November?
Right.
What's it feel like to be that age compared to when you started that first novel?
I can't associate myself with anybody 85 years old. It amazes me in the first place.
You still write?
Yeah, of course. I'll stop when they let me down. But nearly all my friends are dead. My closest friend, Walker Price, he's been dead for 11 years. It's hard to believe it. But that's the way it goes. You take it as it comes, and you hope with some form of grace.
Now, you're married to Gwen, who's here today. How long have you been married to her?
Be 45 years in September.
What's that been like?
I can't imagine being married to anyone for 45 years. Or it's amazing, right?
The one thing that I want you to talk about, because we've talked about it before in interviews, is what's over here on this shelf.
Yeah.
Talking about time, remembrance of things past,
Right.
Marcel Proust, and right here is the...
Proust is my favorite 20th century writer. Ever since my mother gave me this 4-volume Proust for my 17th birthday, and every time I feel I've earned the right to do it, I quit everything and reread Proust. I've done it in the back of this one I wrote each time as the 9th reading in 1993. I haven't felt justified in taking off too much since 93.
So you've read this book, and it's what, 3,000 pages?
Yeah.
9 times.
Right. This is the
Why?
9th reading. It's 2 reasons. One is pure enjoyment. Proust is one of the most entrancing writers that ever lived. And the second, he can teach you something. You can always learn. A writer can learn from Proust. And he can indeed. We were talking about Shakespeare earlier. That's the grand master teacher.
Let me stand over here so folks can see you better. What is it about the written word that's either attractive to people or it separates it from television?
I really think that the written word is what defines us as superior creatures to all the other creatures on earth. Man is characterized by a number of things. One of them is He's the only animal that knows he's going to die someday. And knowing that, he also has an obligation to make the most of whatever time he has. And making the most of it is enormously assisted by reading, by learning about the world, learning about the past and the present, and an ability to look to the future by reading.
I want to tell our audience, if you've just joined us, Shelby Foote will be with us for another 2 hours and 45 minutes. And in about 15 minutes, we'll go to the phones, give you a chance for 2.5 hours to ask him any questions you might like to ask him about anything, including all the writing that he's done. What else are your favorite things in this room?
Oh, Lord, that's a very large question, because I tend to put my favorite things back here.
We're going to talk about all that over there when we get into your seat over there. We got the music over here.
Got music over there, and modern literature mostly over here, although it starts as all of Dickens, all of Conrad, Jane Austen. One of the best Faulkner collections in the country there.
Have you read it all?
Oh, yeah, and over again. What I appreciate more about reading is rereading. I'm a writer, it's my craft. And when you reread a book, especially by a real good writer, you enjoy seeing how he goes about getting where he's going, because you know where he's going when you reread, and you see him prepare for what's coming. And the skill with which he does that is enormously instructive to a writer.
When you read, what's the circumstances?
It's a funny thing. I've talked to people about their reading. I do not see a scene when I read. I read words and even punctuation. A lot of people, they tell me when they read, it's like looking at a movie. They see the characters and what the author is saying they're doing. And of course I do that to some extent, but mostly I'm looking at the way he moves words around.
I remember reading somewhere about you that back at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, you got lost in the 9 stories of stacks in the library?
I didn't get lost. I was very much happy to be there. I imitated a graduate student, and I would get in the cubicle and all this 9 stories of books. I'd never seen anything like that before. And to me, a university is a library with a group of buildings around it. And I spent more time in the library than I did anywhere, even the fraternity house, classroom, no matter. It was the library that I was just fascinated with finding. It not only was there all of Shakespeare there was all the books about Shakespeare there.
What kind of music do you add to your life from over here?
2 kinds. I'm crazy about classical music in every sense, and I'm also a big fan of the blues. Robert Johnson especially, but Bessie Smith, and a great many others.
We talked one time many years ago that when you listen to music, you don't read?
No. I can listen to music while I'm going to sleep, but it's a distraction. I can't put up with what I'm trying to read. I can't do both those things at once.
And so when you listen to music, you don't read. When you read, you don't listen to music.
That's right.
Before we sit down, a couple other things. I don't know if this is going to work, but let's go quickly through the process here. Follow Me Down, novel written what year?
That was written, it came out in 1950. This came out in 49, that in 50, 51, 52, 54, and that one in 75, I think.
Now, these novels are about what?
They're about the Mississippi Delta, possible exception of Shiloh, and there's one of the characters in there is from my home place.
We go up the next level here, and we have the 3-volume set of the Civil War.
Right.
All nonfiction.
Right.
I remember reading that you said you read 350 books to get ready to write that.
I had about 300 books that I actually worked with right over my desk. I didn't much go to libraries, and I did not go to original material in the Department of Archives and History. I wrote from the printed word. But the Civil War is so widely written about that you don't need to go back to the original documents. Everything, they've all been gone over.
Over here is the Shelby Foote and Walker Percy correspondence.
That's our letters. We never knew those would be in print. And that's one of the nicest things about them. We were talking to each other.
What about that friendship? And, you know, how valuable was it to your life?
Well, we were friends for almost exactly 60 years. And I don't know how many people have a friendship that lasts 60 years, but I've never heard of 2 writers getting along for 60 years. So
How did it start?
It started when Walker and his two brothers moved to Greenville. Will Percy, their cousin and adoptive father, came to me at the country club swimming. He came over and said these young people were coming to visit him, and he'd like for me to help show them around town and everything. I said I'd be glad to, and that's the way we met.
What was the best thing about Walker Percy?
The best thing about Walker Percy was Walker Percy. You had to know Walker to know what I mean by that, but anybody can appreciate him by his work. He's one of the great writers of the 20th century.
Won't we walk over near your desk? You have your friend Proust is over there above the bed.
That's my man.
Now, did you sleep in this bed while you were doing your work?
Quite often.
Mm-hmm. How many days in a row would you, when you worked on your last volume of the Civil War in this room, how many days would you work?
7 days a week.
Straight through?
Except time I go to New York or something, take off. But I found that skipping a day's work would cripple me up for coming back to work, so I didn't skip a day. What was the longest stretch that you had during that time where you'd write? You mean how many weeks I'd go without
a break? Schedule? Yeah.
Oh, I might do that for 2 or 3 months.
Without a break?
Well, yeah, I'm a slow writer, so it took I had to work long hours to turn out. A 500 word day is a good day for me. And you would not write more than 500-600 words a day? That was a sort of average. I might take off like a skyrocket and write 1,200 words someday. Other days it might be 50 words. It's hard to say. And this is the chair? This is where you sat? Somewhere I read also this light. It's an old light. The first story I ever sold was to the Saturday Evening Post, and they paid me what was then an enormous sum of $750 for that story. And I bought 3 things. I bought this lamp, a shotgun, which is in the closet there, and a leather jacket, which is also in the closet. I still use all 3 of them. On that desk there, you also use that dip pen we talked about before. Right. Show us the pen. That's the kind that used to be in post offices. And finding points is an absolute nightmare. Finding blotters is a hard thing to do. And I don't know whether there's a pen staff, but I don't worry about that. And I was lucky. I found a whole bunch of points at a dusty old stationery shop that used to be on 44th Street, just down from the Algonquin. And I bought myself a lifetime supply. What kind of paper would you write on? That is a big problem. I write on typewriter paper, and it doesn't take ink anymore the way it used to. So I have a big problem with paper. Now, what's this I have in my hand? That's the manuscript of Shiloh. And at the end of each day, I do the final corrected draft and put it on the stack, and then type it up for the printer. Is this the original, or is this the copy? That's a final day's copy. Each day I would do what I had done that day. I would end the day by making that final copy. Now, you've got up on the shelf there, how many other of your original? Oh, it says Tournament, Follow Me Down, Dry Season, Shiloh. Jordan County's not up here. I didn't save those, but there's September, my 6th novel. You have any idea how valuable those are? No. What are you going to do with them? Leave them to my son. What about your work? I mean, your papers and stuff. They're in the Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill. I'm glad they're there. It's a good place for them. It's a good collection. And what are some of the things that you have there on the back of your desk? Oh, Lord. They're favorites of mine. Chekhov, Keats, Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, myself as an old Confederate scout, a birthday party when I was about 11 years old in Greenville with all my friends, Bedford Forrest, Robert E. Lee, U.S. Grant, Pat Claiborne. Somewhere I read where Pat Claiborne was one of your favorites. Absolutely. Who was he? He's from Arkansas. He's an Irish immigrant who became a lawyer in Helena. And I was interested in the military because he'd done a hitch in the British Army as a corporal. And he's a marvelous general, and his men loved him. He was killed at Franklin in the last year of the war.
Jake, could we get a really good close-up there on that board just so folks can see it not from such a distance? Why Chekhov? And you mentioned him even earlier.
Chekhov is he was born 4 years into this century, but he's as modern today as when he was writing. Chekhov had a tremendous influence on the writing of the short story. All short story writers are influenced for the good by Chekhov. Chekhov had a talent that's not, you can't explain it. Walker and I used to try to figure out how he does these things, how he brings them off. We could never figure how he did it. It's so good.
At this stage in your life, who do you enjoy reading the most?
Always Shakespeare and Proust.
Still.
Those are the standby. There are others, John Keats, Robert Browning, in our time, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and John O'Hara, who's practically disappeared now.
Let's go to the calls. Shelby Foote will be with us for the next 2.5 hours, and we've got some folks waiting, wanting to talk to him about his life and his work on this in-depth program on Book TV. Our first call is from Arlington, Virginia. Go ahead, Arlington. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Hi, I'm a forensic scientist, and I've also done archaeology. And I view both of those as historical sciences in the sense that you're reconstructing the past. It's just a matter of time frame, really. In archaeology, it's hundreds or thousands of years. In forensic science, it may be a couple of hours or days or weeks. But I'm wondering, as a historian, how you view the methodology of history, of being a historian.
The methodology is depends on the historian. I think that historians have a great deal to learn from the novelist. The kind of research that you do supplies you with the facts, and then you breathe life into those facts by telling it well. I don't mean by pumping it up or making any false elevations of the material. It's just do what a good, hard-working novelist does, write as truthfully as possible. And the groundwork is done by archaeologists, if you will, but it's what you do with those facts. No list of facts ever gives you the truth. Quoting Keats, in one of his letters, he said, a fact is not a truth until you love it. And by that he means know how to handle it, have a true affection for it. I'm not sure that answers your question.
If you've just joined us, we're in Shelby Foote's workroom, bedroom, here in his home in Memphis, Tennessee, on our in-depth program, as we take another call from Las Vegas, Nevada. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Mr. Foote, I have a question about Nathan Bedford Forrest. What made him such a tremendous leader of men? He was never educated, as far as I understand, militarily. What made him so successful against the Northern forces?
Forrest had a true native-born genius. His education consisted of about 6 months. He said a thing that would make all writers happy. He said, I never see a pen, but I think of a snake. Forrest, all his gifts were natural. He is, to me, the outstanding genius of the Civil War. I do not mean by that he could have been a better general than R.E. Lee or U.S. Grant or some lesser people, too. But Forrest could look at a piece of ground and know how to use it. He could read an opponent's mind by transferring himself into that man's position. And he's just a miracle to read about. Forrest has gotten a bad reputation with many people nowadays because of his activities as probably head of the Ku Klux Klan immediately after the war. People ought to know, too, that he dissolved that Klan in 1877. because it had turned violent. He was opposed to Klan activities that involve violence. They have to study a lot more about Forrest. Forrest was light years ahead of most of the people in Memphis with regard to civil rights for blacks. Forrest would take a lot of understanding because he'd been so misunderstood.
Let's go to Leesburg, Virginia for Shelby Foote. Good morning. Hello there.
Good morning, Mr. Foote. This is an honor to speak with you. I have two questions. The first one is, have you ever met a Civil War veteran or people from the era? What was that like? Would you learn from them? And then the second question is just broad. What led your heart to a love and a respect for the Civil War?
In the first place, yes. I saw, when I was a boy, Jefferson Davis's home down on the Gulf Coast. It was called Beauvoir. Was the home of Confederate veterans. And I went down there as a boy, about 10 years old, and I saw perhaps 12 of them there, old men with beards. But they had a lively sort of cackling humor to them. It was a great pleasure to be around. I heard a story about one of them. They have visiting days, and the ladies of the region would come to see the old man and entertain them. And a couple of women were there, and there was a veteran who had lost a leg in the war, and he was sitting in a chair over by the wall. And the two women came and stood in front of him, and one shook her head and said, "Oh, my poor man, you've lost your leg." And he looked down and said, "By God, if I haven't." They were like that. What I saw of them, they had mostly probably been drummer boys by then. You know.
How many? Speaking of beards, how many have you had in your life?
I'm sorry.
Beards. How many have you had?
Oh, about 4. I started growing a beard when I started writing the Civil War to find out what it was like to have a beard. So I've had it ever since. I'd shaved it off every now and then. I've had this one for 20 years without shaving.
Long Beach, California. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Foote, it's absolutely a wonderful pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. You were the one that got me really started on the Civil War. I had my grandmother's first husband died in Libby's prison, and I saw Ken Burns' series on the Civil War, and I retired in 1991. I'm 69 years old, and I started reading then, and I haven't stopped reading about the Civil War yet. Your series of books I have, the 3 volumes, and one interesting thing that I found about your books was that the South was winning every battle that they got involved in up until the final stroke, I guess you'd call it, and then all of a sudden the Union came out on top, and it was an interesting reading from that standpoint. I've read everybody. I've cleaned out all the libraries in Long Beach and Bellflower and all the rest of them. But I understand why that happened, and I'm reading Mr. Lee Kinnett's Sherman at the present time, and the more I read, the more detail I get, and the more understanding I have of the way you wrote those 3 volumes. And I want to thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
I thank you. It's good of you to say that. What happened in the war that made the South appear to be much better generaled than the North was that so many Southerners had been to West Point. It was quite common in prominent Southern families for the youngest son to go to a military life. And when the war came along, they went south with their states, and they were probably the most capable. Sherman, whom you've been reading about, gave the explanation. He said that it took the Northern forces a couple of years really to learn how to do what they were doing, and once they really got into it, that's when the North started winning. And for the last 2 years, or certainly the last year, they were practically all Northern victories, and that was because they had learned in the hard school of combat how to do what they had to do.
Talking about West Point, there's an email we received in advance of the program from a John Viteretti. Why don't Civil War historians place greater emphasis on the personal relationships among the generals of the opposing armies, other than Armistead and Hancock? For instance, Longstreet was best man at Grant's wedding. or those other Confederate generals who were present with Lee at Appomattox, all of whom Grant had prior personal relations with.
That is stressed by most historians. I think you'll find that most of them do. One good example is Schofield and John Bell Hood had been roommates at West Point. Here they are opposing each other. And Schofield said later that he saved Hood from being flunking out of West Point by coaching him on mathematics. And he said sometimes he thought that was a mistake.
Oxford, Maryland, you're on with Shelby Foote. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. My question is concerning the Battle of Fredericksburg. And I often wonder why, in doing the little bit of research I've done on the Civil War and in looking at what fiction writers have tackled, that why this battle that was so important for the South often seems ignored among fiction writers and historians. And I was wondering if you had any comments.
Did you say Clarksburg?
No, Fredericksburg.
Fredericksburg. Oh, I don't know of a Civil War historian who doesn't give prominent attention to Gettysburg.
What happened? No, Fredericksburg.
Fredericksburg.
Yeah, what happened to Fredericksburg? At
Fredericksburg was a terrible Union defeat led by Burnside, who attacked an almost impregnable position and was simply slaughtered doing it. But Fredericksburg is interesting for other reasons than being a great Confederate victory. I don't know of any soldiers in the war who were any braver than those men who charged the stone wall at the foot of Marye's Height. Fredericksburg is a hell of an example of Northern courage being matched against a Southern so-called élan. Southerners should have great admiration for the Northern Army, the way it behaved in that, the greatest perhaps of its defeats.
Did you go to the Fredericksburg battlefield in your research?
I went to all battlefields, and I tried my best always to visit them on the anniversary of the battle so that the weather and the leafage on the trees and everything would be as much like that time as possible. Those things are very important to get the feel of the place.
We're in Memphis. Were there many battles fought around this area?
The closest really sizable thing is Shiloh, which is less than 100 miles to the east of here. And that's one of the great battles of the war, the first big one. And there's Bryce's Crossroads down the way. There was a very brief and disastrous naval battle here in Memphis in which all the Confederate boats were sunk except one that managed to get away.
Memphis, right along the Mississippi River. We go to Fresno, California for Shelby Foote. Hello there.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to say to Mr. Lamb, thank you very much for you and C-SPAN for presenting Book TV on the weekends. I am a great fan, and I also have all your books, and I'm a great fan of those, too. For Mr. Foote, it's a great honor to speak with you. This is about writing. I have always been a great reader of both novel and nonfiction, and maybe you can demystify for some of us, for yourself and contemporaries, what takes you from loving books to being actually able to write books? I've always wondered what that golden key was and envied it, and I also greatly admire your library and envy that too. Thank you.
There's been several people who expressed a sort of answer to that. Robert Louis Stevenson, I think it was, said one way to learn how to write is to play the sedulous ape, as he said. Pick a writer that you really like, all the way from Dickens on down, and imitate him until you can do a pretty good job of it. Then establish yourself based on that. That's Stevenson's advice. And he's quite right about learning from other writers. That's the way you learn to write. You learn to write through reading intensively, trying to understand how the man did what he did. And that's where rereading comes in especially handy. When you know where he's going, you can appreciate how he goes about getting there. And you also learn that language has rhythms. You learn that there are balances that can be achieved. And the last thing you learn is how to plot a book.
Did you ever copy anybody yourself?
Absolutely. I copied Browning, Faulkner, all of them. So do all writers. I don't know of any writer who didn't begin writing because of the tremendous influence of someone or many writers.
How often were you in Faulkner's presence, and what was your relationship with him?
Perhaps 10 or 12 times. Spent the night in his house. Took him up to Shiloh once to walk over the battlefield. He was an outgoing, friendly, really nice man. Most people say he was bumptious and so forth. He was only that way from somebody who wanted something from him. I never wanted anything from him except his company.
What was the difference in your ages?
Faulkner's about 15 years older than me.
When did he die?
He died, this is almost unbelievable, he died in 62. And it's hard to believe he's been dead that long.
Nashville, Tennessee. You're on the air with Shelby Foote.
Yes, Mr. Foote. I wrote a lot in college, and then I got a PhD in physics and taught college and taught high school, and I've dug out a lot of my college stuff since I'm nearing retirement and have several ideas about writing. And how do you decide which one to devote your passion and time to? And sort of a second question, why hasn't someone written a great epic novel about the terrible Battle of Franklin, Tennessee?
Your first one is, I don't think you need any encouragement or anything else. It's, if you want to be a writer, you'll be a writer. The way to learn to write is by writing over and over again. Practice describing something that you see. Practice describing someone crossing a room. Practice writing about someone laughing or crying until you get it to satisfy you. Then you're ready to really start. As for a novel about the Battle of Franklin, Franklin is one of the most horrendous things in American history. You saw an army practically destroyed at one stroke. Hood ordered that attack, and the Army of Tennessee came close to going out of existence.
Which side?
The Confederate side nearly went out of existence there. They fought the Battle of Nashville later and then wound up fighting some in North Carolina when the war was approaching its end, but it was never really an army after it was wrecked at Franklin. Hood ordered that thing out of anger. He was trying to discipline his army. He tried to get them to do what he called right over and over again. They kept disappointing him. And it's as if he said, by God, they'll charge these breastworks, and then maybe they'll do right. It was disastrous. He really ruined his army. Pat Claiborne was killed at Franklin, for instance.
Prescott Valley, Arizona. You're next with Shelby Foote.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hi. Mr. Foote, what an honor. A little while ago you spoke, I have two things kind of to mention here. A little while ago you spoke about people who, when they write novels, if they're good, can we just say about Miss Mitchell, when she wrote Gone with the Wind, a lot of us, I was just a kid when I wrote it. I'm 70 now, and when I read it, I was just a kid, but I kept reading it every once in a while, and I learned the southern side of the war between the states. And I felt that started my curiosity about that war. Also, having been born on the 4th of July, I recall walking through Gettysburg and the hair literally standing up on the back of my neck. It's such an honor to be in such a hallowed spot. And thank you for writing all those books. Is that one of the reasons you wrote them? Is because you felt so close to them, having been born there in the middle of all of it?
Yes. I would be in New York, and there'd be a bunch of us either in a nightclub or a restaurant or a hotel lobby or sitting around a room talking. And somebody would say to me, "Are you from Mississippi, aren't you?" I said, "Yep." Said, "Why are you people so crazy about the Civil War?" And it wasn't I who brought the Civil War up. It was he who brought it up. And it's only natural that we Southerners should be interested in the Civil War after it was fought in our own backyard. The other reason we remember it is when I was a boy and a young man, all arguments between boys were settled by some kind of fist fight, mostly push-in matches and so forth, but fights. And those you remember with the greatest clarity are the ones you lost. And that's one reason that the South is so hipped on the Civil War. They lost it and had to accept the consequences of having lost it. As for Gone with the Wind, I think you'd do better to go back and read Vanity Fair, which is taken from. There's a new book out called The Wind Done Gone, and it's much criticized for what it did with Miss Mitchell's book. But she did pretty much the same thing, although in a different way, to Vanity Fair. Rhett Butler and Rawdon Crawley are very similar players. Scarlett O'Hara and what's her name, Becky Sharp are very much similar. There's nothing unusual about that. Many great books get rewritten over and over and over again, thank God.
Dennis, Massachusetts, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Foote, it's an honor to speak with you. I have a comment and a question. The comment is about your problem with paper. As a calligrapher, I use the inkjet paper, and it has a better tooth to it so that you don't have a problem with the paper. And there's a bookseller in Greensboro, John Neal Booksellers, that carries a lot of nibs and things if you ever run out. My question is, I noticed that you seem to have a fob coming out of your pocket. I wonder if there's any significance to the watch that's attached to it. And as someone who had family who fought on both sides of the Civil War, do you think the South will ever get over it? Thank you. I'll hang up and listen.
They may get over it in the sense of not continuing to talk about it continuously, but it's in our blood and bone. We won't get rid of it, and our children won't get rid of it, and they shouldn't get rid of it. They should learn from it. Santianas think about people who don't know their past or be obliged to repeat it is a very real danger. I think it's important that people know the history of their country, and if possible, the history of the people who existed before this was a country. You can't know too much about where you live if you want to understand the nature of man. You are a person, and you live in a place, and the more you know about that place, the more you'll learn about that person whom you are, and it's who you are. It's a thing that Harold Bloom was talking earlier in his book about how important writing and reading are, and that can't be stressed too strongly. It's the reading of books, the absorbing of all they have to teach us, and especially the way they go about teaching us, that set us off from other creatures on this earth. Anybody who neglects reading is making a terrible mistake and missing a glorious time.
The watch fob?
Oh, the watch. This is a watch my wife gave me. My father's watch was very much like it, and it always hung right here on a peg on my desk. And one day I was in the kitchen, the only time in my life I ever baked a cake. I was baking this cake, and I came back, my watch was gone. Somebody had come in the door here and lifted it off there, and about broke my heart because of my father's watch. And my wife got me this one to take.
Why don't you hold it up so we can get a close-up shot of it while we take the next call?
Yeah.
What year did she get this for you?
I think this must have been about 62 or 3 or 4 or 5.
Let's go to Honolulu next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, this is, I'm phoning from Honolulu. And just like first of all, I just finished reading your trilogy of all 3,000 pages. And I'm 59 years old. And also...
You read it all?
I read it all.
And how long did it take you?
Oh, it's a year. It's taken me over a year.
Well, let me ask you the same question I asked Shelby Foote earlier. When you read it, what atmosphere did you create for yourself?
It was more of a cultural experience. My family, historically, I did not know, came from the South, and so was lost. And then I just when the series came out with Ken Burns and Shelby Foote was talking about it, I went back and started researching that my family came from the South. And it was like there was a hole there for the whole family. And so it sort of renewed that we had Southern ties. And
but go back to the reading of the book itself.
Yeah.
How did you read? How much did you read at any one time?
Oh, about 300 pages. It would take me maybe sometimes because I had to work. So I would do it late afternoon, and sometimes maybe I'd only do 10 pages.
what impact did it have on you, and what did it change? What perception about the Civil War changed in your own head?
Well, I had no real experience of the war itself because I just didn't know. I was just really ignorant on it. Even the generals had a huge impact in regards to Pete Longstreet and the relationships between the generals. I had no idea that they even knew each other. So there was a huge void. I knew nothing about the South because I basically came from California. So I had no historical, and my family completely cut it off. My great-grandfather fought in the South. He fought for the Stovall. I think he was under Joe Johnson during the war at Army of Tennessee. So
the Army of Tennessee, right.
And so that's helped me just sort of recreate my Southern roots. And when I was a young kid, I just couldn't believe that, I sort of had this affinity for the South. And I don't know where that came from, and now I know. So I just want to really thank Shelby Foote in regards to helping restore part of my culture. And
thanks, caller, for calling. Those who have just joined us, we're in Shelby Foote's bedroom where he wrote the last of the three-part narrative on the Civil War, 1.5 million words.
Right. What's
your reaction when you hear somebody like this say they immersed in your work?
What pleases me both is they said they have finally begun to understand the Civil War. And I'm particularly pleased to hear him mention Longstreet, one of my great favorites among the generals, also a misunderstood man. You meet these people, and they're operating under terrific pressure. And it's a marvelous chance to see man at his best and worst. And these people, when you're writing about the Civil War, there's a grievous danger of overwriting. The thing is already so lurid that you have to bring it down to make it believable. It's a wonderful subject to write about.
Hagerstown, Maryland. You're next with Shelby Foote. Go ahead. Hagerstown, Maryland. You're on the air. Let's go to Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas, you're on the air. Go ahead, please. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Hello. Yes, my name is Dino Smallis, and I have been a long admirer of you, Shelby. You've really influenced me, not only in the series about the Civil War, but in the way you write, your comments, your input, the insights you have on the individuals. Because of you, that whole series was just so amazing to me, and I think you've made it. I'm thankful to be talking to a living legend. You've inspired me a lot. Being a fellow artist, it's really important to talk to somebody who's still alive. And I've met a lot of artists and everything in my time, and it's always an honor. My questions are two-part. One is, if you collect any memorabilia of anybody in the Civil War that's your favorite, whether it's a soldier or whoever, personal items or writings or mementos. And two, during your observations on all this, have you ever found out who the soldiers are that lived the longest and also died the quickest in battle?
I don't have any questions to that last one. You're right about the Ken Burns thing, and Ken ought to be given credit. He had a great mass of stuff to fool with, and he's the one who organized it and picked out what order it would appear in and how much of each thing. He did a marvelous job on that, and people are always praising us participants, but it was Ken who got that whole thing up and was responsible for getting it out the way he did.
Collectibles?
I never was one to collect memorabilia or weapons or things like that. I have some things I prize. I've got my great-grandfather's Confederate veteran papers. He commanded the Noxubee Cavalry at the Battle of Shiloh. And I treasure the memory of him and his career during the war. But the war has so many things about it that you find attractive, and it's just hard to separate any one thing from another. But as for memorabilia and equipment. I never cared much for that.
We have a little over 2 hours to go with Shelby Foote from his Memphis home. We're going to take a break in a few minutes, but first, Halvertown, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Foote, this is truly a treat for me to speak to you, sir. I have admired you for years. My question to you, sir, is concerning Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson. Had he survived Chancellorsville, sir, do you believe that the outcome of Gettysburg and eventually the war could have been somewhat different? Thank you.
I've never been one for dealing much with might have beens and what ifs. But in Gettysburg, if Jackson hadn't died at Chancellorsville and had been in command of a corps that Ewell commanded, he certainly would have taken Cemetery Hill. It's in Jackson's nature not to stop until he'd gotten every ounce of benefit he could get. But that doesn't mean the Battle of Gettysburg would have been a Confederate victory. The Battle of Gettysburg would have been a brief 3 or 4 hour engagement. The real battle would have been fought down on about 12 miles away where Meade was preparing to fight it, and it would have been a different story entirely. If you start speculating as to what would happen, you've got a whole jumble of things on your hands that you can't handle. But unquestionably, if Jackson had been there, he would indeed have taken Cemetery Hill, which Ewell failed to do. But in that case, the Union Army simply would have retreated to the line Meade was drawing 12 miles away. And it would have probably been a very similar battle to the one at Gettysburg. Although Meade had a position at Gettysburg, it was the closest thing to a moated castle out of the Middle Ages the world ever saw. It was a marvelous defensive position.
Atlanta, Georgia. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Foote, you mentioned Walker Percy, and I understand you grew up with the Walker Percy, the Percy family. It seems that currently William Alexander Percy, who wrote Lanterns on the Levee, and that is still in print, has come under some criticism, and I wondered what your assessment of William Alexander Percy is.
Caller, what was the criticism that you've seen?
That the Percy family was sort of lord over the whole entire Greenville area for a number of years, and some of their decisions concerning the help in the flood were incorrect decisions or in error.
That all comes out of a book published about 3 years ago called Rising Tide. It's about the flood in the Delta. And that has promoted a lot of criticism of Will Percy. First place, I sort of halfway grew up in the Percy house, and Mr. Will was a mentor, if I ever had such a thing. He was an absolutely marvelous man to be around. Will Percy could talk to you about John Keats, and you paid him a supreme compliment of wanting to get the hell out of there, go home and read some Keats. He was that kind of teacher. He was that kind of man. The criticism of him is based on something that's partly fact. The Percy family did dominate in a lordly way that section of the country, but you got to see what came out of it. In Greenville, the Ku Klux Klan never made any headway at all. The Citizen Council was ineffective. There were no riots in Greenville. That's partly because of the leadership of the Percy family, not only Mr. Will, but the boys that were there after he was gone. You have to be cautious about criticizing people because they exercise a certain kind of power. Their power is for good as well as bad. And the Percy family distinguishes Greenville in other ways. Greenville had more writers per square yard than any town in the United States that I ever heard of. And that was largely because of Will Percy being there.
Who else was from there?
Harding Carter, Walker and me, Charles Bell. There were about 12 writers from Greenville. It's very strange. It's like lightning struck a certain place or something.
Anna Cortez, Washington, for Shelby Foote. Hello.
Mr. Foote, what a treat. Hey, I've been an admirer of yours for years and years, and I'm also an admirer of Longstreet. And I've been wanting to ask you for years, what was going through Lee's head at Gettysburg when he did the same thing with Pickett's charge he did at Fredericksburg that worked so well for him, he did against him, and why wouldn't he let Hood and Longstreet go around to the right, which seems like a smart choice to make. Just go around and come in behind the Union Army and not make Pickett's charge at all. What was going through his head with that?
I don't know what was going through his head, and neither does anybody else. And I resent anybody trying to tell me what was going through his head. What happened was Lee committed probably the biggest mistake made by any general on either side when he ordered what's called Pickett's charge on the third day at Gettysburg. But that's what's so interesting about Gettysburg. The first day, if it hadn't been for Ewell holding back, he would have taken Cemetery Hill and won the battle all in one day. And the second day, he gets men right up there on the ridge, fixing to go over. He's looking into the Yankee rear. And he thought the third day, this will do it. There's no doubt about it. I came so close on day one, even closer on day two. Here on day three, all we have to do is press it and we've won. The result was the biggest mistake, as I said, any general made on either side. At Gettysburg, there were 50,000 casualties, and over half of them were Confederate, mainly because of that charge on the last day. Pickett's division lost approximately 70% of its strength in that one charge. And I don't know how those men bore that kind of losses. I'm talking about the men who ordered them into battle. When Lee went to bed that night, finally, it must have been terrible for him to think of all those dead Virginians out on the field as a result of his orders.
If you joined us just a few moments ago, we are with Shelby Foote in his Memphis home, and we're in a room where he spent a lot of time since 1967 or 66?
66.
66. How much has been written in this room?
All of the third volume and another novel, a sixth novel, and a number of articles, pieces.
What part of Memphis is your home in?
It's almost the geographical center of the original sort of Memphis that was here when I moved here in the 50s.
And are you writing anything else now?
Nothing of any real importance. I'm writing forwards to books like studies of Chekhov and various people.
We'll be back with Shelby Foote for another 2 hours to take your calls after a short break.
Book TV's In Depth with Shelby Foote will return in just a moment.
Next month on In Depth, historian Richard Brookhiser, senior editor at the National Review and columnist for the New York Observer. His many books include The Outside Story, How Democrats and Republicans Re-elected Reagan, The Way of the Wasp, How It Made America and How It Can Save It, so to speak, Founding Father, Rediscovering George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, American, and his new book, America's First Dynasty, The Adamses, 1735 to 1918, coming out in February. Join Richard Brookhiser as he discusses his views on history, current events, and takes your phone calls on In Depth, October 7th, beginning live at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific Time.
Labor Day on C-SPAN 2 is all about Book TV's in-depth interviews. At 8 a.m. Eastern, we begin with Studs Terkel. At 11, it's James McPherson. At 2 p.m., it's In-Depth Joan Didion. At 5, William F. Buckley talks about his life and works. And prime time starts with Gore Vidal at 8 Eastern. Followed by Stephen Ambrose at 11 Eastern, 8 Pacific. Then In-Depth, Toni Morrison is our overnight feature at 2 a.m. Eastern, 11 p.m. Pacific. And In-Depth, Norman Podhoretz completes the special series starting at 5 a.m. Eastern, 2 Pacific on Tuesday. Book TV's In-Depth interviews, all Labor Day and night, starting at 8 a.m. Eastern, on C-SPAN 2. Book TV's In-Depth with Shelby Foote will air again tonight in its entirety. You can see the writer, playwright, and Civil War historian discuss his life's work and the writing process tonight, beginning at midnight Eastern.
My hope is that this festival will encourage a whole nation to read together on September 8th. And I hope you'll join us here in our nation's capital for an unforgettable experience, cover to cover. Thank you all.
Next Saturday on C-SPAN 2, Book TV live from the National Book Festival. Our coverage begins at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, 6:30 Pacific, and you'll hear from authors and editors including Stephen Ambrose, Nathaniel Philbrick, David McCullough, John Hope Franklin, Marie Arana, Liz Carpenter, and George Will. The National Book Festival, live next Saturday all day, starting at 9:30 a.m. Eastern and 6:30 a.m. Pacific. Only on Book TV, only on C-SPAN 2.
The Vicksburg National Military Park was a recent stop for the C-SPAN school bus. There, the crew learned about the siege of Vicksburg during the Civil War.
The civilians of Vicksburg suffered the same hardships as the Confederate soldiers defending the fortress city on the river. At the outbreak of the siege, General Grant, the Union commander, sent in a flag of truce, informing the civilian population that they were being given an opportunity to leave the city, but this would be the only opportunity they would get. Otherwise, they would be subjected to the same hardships as the Confederate garrison. Roughly one half the civilian population left at that time. The other half, roughly 2,500 people, remained in the city of Vicksburg, and there they were pinned, just as with the garrison, for the long 47 days of siege. During the course of the siege of Vicksburg, rations for both citizens and soldiers alike grew scarce. In order to conserve what food supplies were on hand, General Pemberton, the Confederate commander, ordered the rations immediately cut to 3/4 the standard issue, then to half, then to quarter, then they were cut again, and yet again, and yet again. By the end of June, the garrison of Vicksburg was subsisting on a handful of peas and rice, issued once a day per man. It's not very much to maintain your strength upon, but it is all they had. Even their water was rationed to just 1 cup per day. The citizens, on the other hand, had their own food supplies available to them. They were off limits to the army. But even the civilians found themselves rationing their own food to ensure that it would last throughout the siege of Vicksburg. By many accounts, you could go down to the marketplaces on Washington Street and there see skinned rats hanging for sale. They went for an exorbitant price. Only the very wealthy citizens could afford them. To avoid the shelling of the Union Navy, citizens fled to caves that were carved into the hillside scattered about Vicksburg, and there they lived like rats underground for more than 6 weeks. About the only time they came out of their cave is when the Union guns fell silent as the cannoneers were eating their morning, noon, or evening meal. By all accounts, as the citizens emerged from these caves, they were ashen white in complexion, very frail. But they withstood the hardships of the siege without muttering a single word of complaint. They offered words of encouragement and support to the garrison of Vicksburg and hoped that it would help sustain them in defense of the city.
On July 4th, 1863, the siege of Vicksburg ended with the surrender of Confederate troops to General Grant's Union forces.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2. If you'd like a videotape copy of the programs you've been watching this weekend or any weekend on Book TV, call 1-877-ON-C-SPAN for pricing information or to request a tape. Or go online to cspan.org/shop and click on Book TV.
We're back in Memphis at Shelby Foote's home in the middle of the city. And the camera soon will show you the little lounge outside of the bedroom here where Mr. Foote did his interview with Ken Burns in 1990 for the Civil War series. And a lot of his books there on the back shelf as Jake walks into the room here with a camera on his shoulder and shows us where we're going to be located for the next 2 hours. Shelby Foote, I have an email here from David Lamon, Valdosta, Georgia. Can you compare and contrast the treatment of the Confederate prisoners by the Union with that of the Union prisoners by the Confederacy?
That's rather difficult to do. There's been a great many exaggerations on both sides. and there's a terrific amount of suffering on both sides, so it's hard to exaggerate what they've managed. Andersonville was supposed to have about a fourth as many men in it as were in it, and they had to subsist on about what the Confederate soldier was getting to live on, which wasn't really enough for anybody to live on. But the soldier was out where he could scrounge around and find something else. These prisoners in Andersonville couldn't. The northern prison camps, Camp Chase and various others, had the added discomfort of people freezing to death. There was some serious deaths resulted from that. The medical side of the Civil War is very interesting. A great many men died, for instance, of measles. We don't think of measles as being a killing disease. There's a new medical center for the Civil War at Fredericksburg, Frederick, Maryland, that is very good on that kind of thing. And you can go to Andersonville now. It's become a park where you can go to and you can see what horrible things happened there.
Andersonville's in Georgia?
Yeah, it's in Georgia. The trouble was there was no organization by the prisoners themselves. There were few, if any, officers in that camp. That was mostly for enlisted men. And they formed gangs and did terrible things to each other in addition to what was being done to them by the Confederate guards. And they were being guarded by old men and boys. It was a tragic thing to have happen. And the same way in camps in the North.
Your trilogy on the Civil War, published over 20 years, 1.5 million books. When was the last word written for the last of the 3 books?
It was, I think, on May Day of 1974.
What'd you do that day?
I had an experience very similar, if I can boast a little, to what Gibbon had when he finished The Decline and Fall. He said that when he finished it, he felt elation, and then he felt a great sadness, as if he'd lost a good friend. He wouldn't be working on his Decline and Fall anymore. I had pretty much that kind of reaction.
Urbana, Illinois. Go ahead, please. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Yes, Mr. Foote. I've read your 3 volumes twice, and since then, of course, I've read quite a bit of other stuff, and it got me interested in not only the Civil War, but in, of course, Napoleon and Hannibal, and that's what and the Mexican War. And I called. The reason I called is I have written a little bit for my Civil War Roundtable about Kenai. And Cannae. Everybody pronounces it differently. But the reason I got interested in that, and when I first saw it, was of course in your book. I read a few hundred books on the Civil War by now, but the only place I've ever seen that referred to was in your book, where you would say that a particular general was hoping to convert this particular situation into his Kenai. And so that when people ask me, how did you get involved in get interested in Hannibal, I tell them that, and they say, well, where did he refer to that? And I don't know. I just hope that you can remember.
Kenai is cited often in history because it's the battle that's the most complete victory that you can have in war, and all generals are trying to score another Kenai.
Where was it?
It was in Italy, and they were coming down out of the Alps. I don't know the exact geographical location of it.
What do you think is the best thing about your writing? I mean, what is it that you do uniquely that no one else does?
A person is not very good at commenting about his own work. Alan Tate pointed out one time that when a writer talks about his own work, a specific page of it or anything else, he not only sees what's on the page, he sees that what he intended to put on the page. He thinks he put it on there, and sometimes he didn't. So a writer is not a very good judge of his own work. But if I had to say what gives me the most pleasure about what I've done is I think good writing is always tied into speech. It should be able to be read freely so that it flows in a certain sense and has certain rhythms. I try for that, and I hope I achieve it from time to time.
Now, for those who've just joined us, you're sitting at your desk where you wrote the last of the 3 books on the Civil War, and that light above it, that fluorescent light, you had for how many years?
I've had that since 1947, I think, or 8, whichever it was.
And you still have the dip pen that you use when you write?
Right. It's right here.
Do you have ink? Huh? You have ink in there?
Yeah.
Do you have the paper you would write on?
Right.
Could you show us? I mean, we'll take some calls here, but can you show us what it looks like when you're actually writing on in the paper you're using?
Yeah. Well, let's just take a piece of paper.
While you do that, I'll take this next call from Portland, Oregon. Go ahead, Portland. You're on the air.
Hi. Pleasure to speak to you, Mr. Foote. I'm really interested in your perspective on the Civil War as well as your perspective on your writing. My question is this. I have been doing some research on my family and have found that my relatives from southern Kentucky fought on the side of the North. Now, we often hear that the Civil War is brother against brother, and I've never really found a good source that talks about what was in the hearts and minds of the individual soldiers, of why they would choose to fight for the Union or the Confederacy in those border states. Do you have a comment on that?
It frequently was a family thing. You had some northern men who were generals in the Confederate Army because they'd married southern women before the war, and they went with their wife when they came along. You had southern men fighting on the northern side. George Thomas of Virginia, one of the very best of the northern generals, was a Virginian. You went where your sympathies went, and the main thing was not to stand aside. Almost everybody was involved in that war, especially Southerners. On the northern side, you could avoid conscription by paying $300 every time your number came up. But as for people from Kentucky or Maryland, even Tennessee, where there's a divided choice among the people, you went the way your heart led you, is the only way I can explain it. Kentucky is unusual. It had a star in the Confederate flag, but it never seceded. And Kentucky joined the Confederacy after the war was over. It was the Confederate veterans who got there all the political offices in the years following the Civil War.
Wheaton, Maryland, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
I really appreciate C-SPAN's Book TV. It's a great pleasure to me. I'm a lifelong historian. But with speaking to Mr. Foote, I'm a native Washingtonian, and my mother's people came from Howard County, Maryland, and fought on the side of the North. But to make a long story short, I just finished a contract up in Boston, and I've always had to dissuade people from thinking of D.C. as a northern city, which many of them do. And I was wondering if you could wade in on my side here. I'd really appreciate it.
Well, it's sitting right there between Virginia and Maryland, two southern states. Of course, Washington is a southern city. The joke is that it has southern efficiency and northern charm, which is a strange combination.
What year did you spend in Washington?
I was in Washington as a playwright in residence at the Arena Stage in '63 and '4, parts of both those years. I enjoyed it very much. I like Washington.
In what schools have you been a writer in residence or a lecturer?
Only one. I spent a semester at Highlands College to pay my daughter's tuition.
Did she go there?
Yeah.
Let's go to San Bernardino, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Foote. A couple years ago, I visited Gettysburg Battlefield, and to my surprise, being from California, was a monument accredited to the California Regiment. But even more surprising than that was a story about a historical character that really I can't understand why he's in historical obscurity. His name was Senator Edward Dickinson Baker, and he was Abraham Lincoln's best friend. I found out he was instrumental in keeping the Western states from seceding from the Union. Right. He was killed at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, which then formulated, as a result, the conduct of the Committee of the Conduct of the War, which many felt had a negative impact on the Union soldiers. I don't understand why this man has never. In the general history of the Civil War, you never hear about this man, and yet I think he was. I think he was also the only active U.S. senator to be killed in action acting as an active Army officer. And I don't understand. He's a very interesting character. Had a very great influence on the Civil War, and we never hear about him. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, Baker's largely been forgotten because he was a damn fool. He mishandled those troops at Ball's Bluff something awful. He was quoting Walter Scott and taking up a very dangerous position on the lip of a bluff. He was Lincoln's best friend, and so one time anybody saw Lincoln cry was when he got the news of Baker's death. But Baker was pretty close to a total loss militarily.
What cities in the United States have you lived in besides Greenville and Memphis?
I was in New York for a short period of time, worked for Associated Press out of a local desk there, and I have not lived in any other city except that 3 months in Washington.
We've talked about this before, but you were court-martial when you were in the United States Army. How many years did you spend in the Army?
I joined the Mississippi National Guard in October of '39 after Hitler went into Poland, and we were mobilized in November of '39 of '40, and we went to Camp Blanding, Florida, and I went from there to OCS at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Came out a lieutenant, went to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, then to Camp Bowie, Texas, and then went overseas from there and was assigned to the 5th Division. A lot of West Pointers. They'd been in Iceland for a year or so. And I got crossways of a lieutenant colonel on the artillery chief staff. His name was Tuffy Horner. And he and I had a contretemps about his cussing one of my men. And he laid for me and got me for falsifying a trip ticket. Whenever you use a government vehicle, you sign a trip ticket. They had an order that you didn't use a government vehicle for recreation beyond a radius of 50 miles. And we were the only artillery battalion. We were 52 miles from Belfast. And it was quite common among us to write down 49 miles so as not to break the rule about 50 miles. And I was charged with falsifying a government document, court-martialed and sent home, right back to the United States.
Were you dishonorably discharged?
They called it other than honorable, which amounts to the same thing.
But you got back in the Marine Corps.
Well, when I got to New York, I went to work for Associated Press, and all these things were going on out in the Pacific and Marines. And I went down and joined the Marine Corps. And I went through boot camp at Parris Island. They had a good time with me. My fellow Marines would say, I understand you used to be a captain in the Army. You might make a pretty good Marine private.
And when you got out of the Marine Corps, were you honorably discharged from that?
Yeah. They did such a nice thing just about 6 months ago. There's a staff major from Little Rock over here, the Marine Corps, at the instigations from people in Chicago. They brought me a dress sword for the Marines, and it has Captain Shelby Foote on the blade of it, so I'm honorarily promoted to captain of the Marine Corps.
Is that what we have up here?
Yeah, it's up on.
Next call, Corpus Christi, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I was making a trip through all the Civil War battlefields a few years ago, and we were talking to a little old lady who was a librarian at Lookout Mountain, I think it was. And we asked her if she'd ever read Shelby Foote books, and she said, well, of course I've read Shelby Foote's books. But I just wanted to tell you that. But I was wondering, do you have an affinity for Southern soldiers that you didn't have for Northern soldiers, like, say, at the Battle of Franklin, did it kind of break your heart to see Patrick Claiborne go down? And
it sure did. Some reviewers have noticed that I've been praised, and I appreciate it enormously for being impartial in my history about Northern and Southern forces. But some of them have said you can't escape seeing that his heart beats a little faster when there's a Confederate victory, and I suppose that's true. But the highest compliment I get is from people who say they can't tell from reading my book which side I'm on or for. But I certainly have some Southern bias. A good example of Southern bias is when you see a list of people killed in an automobile crash or airplane crash, you look for Southerners down the list. That's a good sign of it.
Flagstaff, Arizona. Hello there.
Thank you, C-SPAN, for having Mr. Foote on today. And Mr. Foote, I'd like to ask you, when I read about the Civil War and try to comprehend what goes on, I lose a timeline. I really can't seem to get in my mind which order, which battle came first or last or whatever. And you as a writer, you seem to have had the advantage of visiting the actual sites, and that would help you understand it. I understand that. I understand put together the timeline. Can you make a recommendation of anything to help me get through this timeline problem that I have?
Yes, read the actual reports that you'll find in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. It's 128 volumes. You can pick it up almost anywhere. And you hear them speak as they spoke at the time. That's of great value. Reminiscences are good to read. Orderly examinations of military movements by modern writers are good to read, too. But the most valuable stuff is the stuff out of that time so that you can get in tune with the way those men felt. It's not hard to do because they didn't hesitate to express their feelings. We have a guardedness nowadays about expressing our feelings. They didn't have that. They were not afraid that somebody would scorn them for having this, that, or the other. And yet somehow they were not really sentimental. They had a hard core of honesty about them that's interesting to encounter. We've gotten so cluttered up nowadays, we don't know what is and what isn't sentimental, except they pronounce everything as sentimental, which sometimes I think is true.
St. Paul, Minnesota. Hello there.
Hello.
St. Paul, Minnesota. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Thank you. This is such an honor. Shelby Foote has been an absolute hero. I am one of those old-fashioned little Southern girls. Raised by Yankees, I'll have you know. My parents were both Northerners. I was the only rebel in my family. Two things I want to make comment. I believe I read an article, a little article in the newspaper. I'm from Florida, and I went to a high school in Florida, Nathan Bedford Forrest High School. I caught an article that you and his granddaughter, I believe, if you could just confirm this, I thought this was a funny little story. Y'all were playing with his sword. Also, if you could, and I hope this isn't too touchy of a subject, I'm kind of brokenhearted about the issue of the Confederate flag. Thank you again for the opportunity.
First, who is Nathan Bedford Forrest?
Nathan Bedford Forrest is a Memphian. He's a native of Middle Tennessee, born in Chapel Hill, Tennessee. Lived most of his young life in northern Mississippi down there, especially in Hernando, which is about 25 miles from here.
And you got a picture on your board back
there. This is Forrest right here.
Did you play with the granddaughter?
His granddaughter was an old lady when I knew her, and I was very fond of her. And she let me swing the general's saber around my head a couple of times. I got a great kick out of that. I had a funny thing I've told before. After I'd studied the war hard and learned, I thought a good deal about it, I called her on the telephone and said, I've studied this war hard and long, and I've decided it had two authentic geniuses. One was Abraham Lincoln, and the other was your grandfather, Bedford Forrest. And there was a silence at the other end of the line. And she said, you know, in our family, we never thought much of Mr. Lincoln. She didn't like my coupling her grandfather with Abraham Lincoln all these years later. I told this story on Ken Burns' Civil War thing. And
what about the flag?
It always tickled me.
On the Confederate flag?
The flag, I regret very much what has happened about the flag. The flag that people look at now is the flag that was carried during the demonstrations against civil rights. It was carried by Ku Klux Klansmen, all that kind of thing, and that's what it represents to a great many people, and I don't wonder that they're feeling pain and wanting to take it down. I understand perfectly well they do that. But to my mind, they're misidentifying that flag. That flag represents many good things. And you have to translate yourself back into the time of secession to understand how some states should want to secede. The Constitution had not been amended in 61 years. This was the First Amendment, the Emancipation Amendment was the First Amendment in 61 years of the Constitution, and absolutely the first amendment that ever had anything to do with anybody's private property. So they saw this amendment coming. They said, we don't want any part of this union. We want to get out of it. And people who say slavery had nothing to do with the war are just as wrong as the people who say slavery had everything to do with the war. That was a very complicated civic thing. Robert Toombs or somebody once gave the best definition of that war I've ever heard. He said it was a war of one form of society against another form of society. And because one of those forms of society included chattel slavery, and the other side didn't, except to a limited extent, it's always been identified as a war over slavery. Believe me, no soldier on either side gave a damn about the slaves. They were fighting for other reasons entirely in their minds. Southerners thought they were fighting the Second American Revolution. Northerners thought they were fighting to hold the Union together. And that held true throughout the whole war, except for some people who were absolute partisans on both sides, fire eaters in South Carolina and abolitionists in Massachusetts. But most of the people were fighting because they were fighting for, Southerners once said, I'm fighting because you're down here. If you want to invade my home, you got me to fight. Others say you're trying to tear the fabric of the Union, therefore you should be put down and not allowed to do what you claim you want to do. It's a very complex subject, and I'm sorry to see it degenerate into such things as identifying that flag as a symbol of racism. It is not. It was never intended as such. The Confederacy respected law above all things.
Just joined us. We're in Memphis, Tennessee, at Shelby Foote's home in his bedroom, where he spent a lot of time writing. And do you read in this room?
I'm sorry?
Do you read in this room?
Absolutely. I've got an Eames chair that I sit in and read for hours on end. Yeah.
Do you read by yourself?
Always.
Why?
I don't know. It's reading is a serious business, and I don't read it unless it's something that really interests me outside the newspaper in the morning at breakfast. I have no patience with reading trash. I don't do it anymore.
How long at a time will you read?
Oh, a 6-hour stretch of reading is not a long time.
Henderson, Nevada. You're on with Shelby Foote. Go ahead, please.
Hello. My question concerns President Jefferson Davis during the Civil War. I find that he was greatly criticized after the war was over, and I wanted to get Mr. Foote's impression of his presidency and what he thought perhaps were his 2 or 3 best decisions that benefited the South, and opposite of that, the decisions that detrimented the South, and what he thought of his overall presidency.
It's very difficult to add anything to what's gone on all these years. I developed a great affection for Davis and a great admiration for him. I can quote Robert E. Lee, who said he never heard of anybody he thought would have done better than Jefferson Davis, and he personally didn't know of anybody who had done as well. Lee was a great admirer of Davis, which is a huge recommendation of Davis. Davis had a stiff rectitude about him that repulsed some people. And it's the exact opposite of Davis in his natural state. He was a family man, loved his wife, his children, and did so all his life. He was warm and outgoing, but everybody took him to be this cold creature, the devil incarnate and so forth. Davis was not like that. He had a code of honor that he obeyed to his own conscience that alienated him from people. One instance of it is he had a friend in the who was an officer in the Army, a brigadier general, as a matter of fact, and his superiors wanted him fired because he wasn't a very good officer. And they came to Davis and said so, and Davis signed his dismissal. And the man came to him and said, "You, my old friend, how could you do this to me?" And Davis wouldn't betray what he felt was a confidence with these superiors who came there complaining about him. So he didn't want to make personal enemies between these people. And all he said was, "You've got your orders, and all you can do is obey them."
Milford, Delaware. Hello there. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Hello, Mr. Foote. Coming from a state that was has been deemed a border state, and living in the southern part of the state of the southernmost, the third county of Sussex, we flew the Stars and Bars at the time of the war, and we also had a regiment that fought admirably at Gettysburg from the north. One of the things that I have studied and I have seen and I have a difficult time grasping is the way that tactics were used with regard to the Napoleonic system of warfare. I have read many times where you stood shoulder to shoulder as we went forward. But didn't we learn anything from the previous wars as far as the Indians and the Revolutionary War, etc., and people who fought behind trees and rocks and things of that nature? It seemed that obviously I had a difficult time grasping the fact that men would go forward to their deaths as far as that system of warfare was being used. And of course, with the weaponry changing at the time with technology and whatnot, with the mini ball and the rifled slug, it just seems to me that with the excellence as far as knowledge that men had at that time, as far as being generals and captains, etc., down through the ranks, that we would be able to get away from that point as far as the knowledge was concerned and try to fight a war that was utilized against us in the past. I'd like to hear your comment on that, please, sir.
You're quite right. You're on to the clue of why casualties were so heavy in that war. They believed that to mass your fire, you had to mass your men. So you lined up shoulder to shoulder and went forward. And a great deal of dependence on the bayonet, frightening the enemy into retreating. There were very few bayonet wounds in that war. And this lining up shoulder to shoulder and advancing was the reason for the huge casualties that they suffered. The Battle of Shiloh, there were 100,000 men on that field. There were 24,000 casualties. By a coincidence, that's the same percentage of casualties that there were at Waterloo. When they ended the Battle of Shiloh and saw the results of it, they should have said, "Wait a minute, we're fixing to kill all the young men in this country if we don't stop." And there were another 10 or 12 Shilohs down the road, in other words, 10 or 12 Waterloos. But they seemed to get more determined to fight than ever. The worse the higher the casualties were, the more determined they were to fight. It had something to do with units coming from places. The 16th Mississippi would all be from one county somewhere, or the 12th Illinois would be from some county somewhere. And those men had a closeness to each other that it just tears your heart to think of them go through 4 years of war, a squad of, say, 12 men, and maybe 2 of them coming out alive at the end of it, and they're such close friends all the way through it, that you would think somewhere would stop. But there's another answer, too, that I think carries maybe more weight. If I were one of Pickett's soldiers lined up there and had a chance to look across that field, which is nearly a mile wide, downhill and uphill, all those guns laid, training on that open ground, all those men entrenched and waiting for me behind rocks and things, I would have said, Moss Robert, I don't think we'll do this thing. In fact, I ain't going. But then you have to stop and think. It would have taken more nerve to say, Moss Robert, I ain't going, than it would to go. And those men felt that way about it. They were close to each other. Soldiers know that they're dependent on each other. And there are many factors that go into their surviving those huge casualties that they suffered.
Las Vegas, you're on with Shelby Foote.
Shelby, in relation to what you just said, one general that comes to mind, Burnside, I believe his name was, from the north, who, in my opinion, slaughtered his men up in more than one occasion. And my question to you, if you feel the same, is how a man like that could get into the position and retain it, and whatever happened to him. Thank you.
He became commander of the Army of Potomac sort of by elimination. Hancock turned it down. There was Burnside to fall back on. And Burnside was a very likable man. He was something of a pistol slapper and a flamboyant-looking fellow, but a decent, likable man. And Lincoln thought he'd give him a chance. He looked like a man who might accomplish something. He was dreadfully wrong, and he later knew he was wrong. Burnside stayed in the Army until after the Crater affair down in Petersburg, when he was sent home. But he was a senator after that, had a distinguished post-war career. I always liked Burnside. There's something very attractive about him. It's very hard to say. On the Confederate side, there's Bragg, who is a sort of despicable creature in many ways, but I found him very attractive in his in the way he handled certain situations that came his way. He was detested by everybody that was under him, all over him, except Jefferson Davis, who looked after him. But it's hard to make judgments on these men. I like to think they all did their best, and if they failed, they failed.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for Shelby Foote.
Hello. It's a real honor to speak with you, but you started to address this before, but what I'd like to ask is, what do you think, now a lot of people are saying that this war was nothing but economic warfare on the South. What's your impression of that? Thank you. Goodbye.
I think we had reached that point that it used to be when two men got in an argument, somebody said, let's step out in the alley and settle this. It was almost that benighted. We think of ourselves as superior people with a superior form of government. If we are superior as we think we are, we wouldn't have fought that war. We would have done the thing we have a genius for doing, which is avoiding confrontations. We can find some kind of way to get along. That time it failed. It did not work, and we had this terrible thing that resulted in a loss of 1,095,000 men, simply because we failed to reconcile our differences. And I hope it was a terrible lesson to us not to let something like that happen again.
What was the split on the 1,095,000?
The split was about, I've forgotten the actual figures. The northern casualties were much larger because they had so many more men. They had about 2 million men. The South had maybe 800,000.
Is that figure including both killed and wounded?
Killed and wounded, and even captured in many cases.
Stockton, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes.
You're on the air.
Okay, this is back to the military topic. I was commissioned into the Army Reserve in Kentucky in 1960. And the unit that I was in spent our summer camps at Fort Gordon down in Augusta, Georgia. And other units at Fort Gordon were from Arkansas. And I remember this major from Arkansas who was a farmer, but he called himself a gentleman planter. And he wore, off duty, he wore cord suits with wide brim woven farmer's hats. And he didn't have to be in the reserve. I'm sure he didn't have any statutory requirement he was fulfilling, but he just loved the Army and he stayed active. And I'd like to hear your comment about the military tradition in the South in the 20th century.
He doesn't sound like a very good representative of it, but there is a military tradition, or was. Anytime you'll see a list of soldiers or sailors or anything, you'll notice a large percentage of Southerners on it. There are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people went into the Army instead of going to school because they couldn't afford it. A lot of went into the Army as liking it as a way of life. But they've always recruited an awful lot of soldiers from the South as compared to other parts of the country. As for this fellow, God knows what made him the way he was.
Who in your family fought in the Civil War?
My great-grandfather. His name was Hezekiah William Foote.
What was he like?
I wouldn't know. He died long before I was born, but he lived to be 87 or 8 years old. He was born in the War of 1912 and died about the time of the Spanish-American War. A hell of a span of history. And he was from Chester District, South Carolina, moved to Mississippi, the Black Prairie region, in about the 1830s. And my grandfather was his youngest son. He sent him to manage plantations that he had in the Delta there.
You say...
there's his picture.
In your history, you had two grandfathers that were rich but died broke?
Yes, both. But there's nothing unusual about that. Where I'm from, the Mississippi Delta, every family I know of has been on top and on bottom. The credit's easy. You go to the bank, you're a farmer, planter. You go to the bank, you want to borrow $30,000. The banker says, why not take 50? So you take 50, and if it comes due, you lose your land. It happens all the time.
Toledo, Ohio, for Shelby Foote. Hello.
Hi. First of all, it's a real honor, Mr. Foote, to talk to you. And two questions. I'll try and make these succinct. Has there been any literature or research on whatever happened to your typical soldier? I have difficulty believing that they experience this carnage at these battles and go back to their farms in Ohio and Mississippi. Alcoholism, drug use, what was their post-traumatic stress syndrome, which we use with Vietnam soldiers. I mean, it'd be an area, I don't know if it's been explored, but I'm curious about how they survive mentally this. And secondly, your opinion on preservation of the battlefields, and that I visited Stone River last spring, and they've done everything except put tunnels under it, it's looked like, with that urban sprawl from Nashville. Right. Thank you.
You're quite right to wonder about all those things. As for the preservation of battlefields, I can't begin to tell you how important I think that is. When you know what happened on that ground and you go stand there, something comes out of that ground. It's hard to explain how it comes about, but there's something that comes out of that ground almost. I have stood in what was called a bloody angle at Spotsylvania at dawn, and I'll swear I was in the middle of the Battle of Spotsylvania. It's a very strange thing. It's a mystical thing. I can't explain it, but it's very important that that ground be preserved because of this thing that I think almost anybody can feel. You need to know a little bit about what went on there, and the more you know, the more real it gets. But you can really feel that you've been where something happened when you go to those fields.
What about his other part? He was talking about post-traumatic syndrome.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. A tour in Vietnam was a horrible thing to go through, but imagine 4 years of carnage in the Civil War and the post-traumatic syndrome thing after the war must have been terrific. A statistic will tell you, and a partner, how horrible it was. The first year after the war, the state of Mississippi spent a solid 1/5 of its revenues on artificial arms and legs. That's how bad the war was in Mississippi. And how those men reacted, so far as I can see, it was not like Vietnam. It was not like Vietnam. They remembered the war with something closely resembling affection. It's not easy to explain. And I'm sure many of them had horrible nightmares of things that they saw. anybody who went through anything like the mule shoe at Spotsylvania, I don't see how he ever slept again in his lifetime. But they took it remarkably well.
Santa Ana, California. Go ahead, please. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Yes, hello. My name is Ian Guajardo. It's nice meeting you, Dr. Foote. There's a couple of questions here, one of which the Hunley is a big thing right now, discovered just recently, and the monitor was discovered some years back, and parts of the monitor are being brought up. But one of the things being discussed today is how the people died in the Hunley and what necessary procedures they're going to take to determine how those people died in the Hunley. Thank you very much, Dr. Shelby. Appreciate it.
What's he talking about, Shelby?
He's talking about the Hunley, the world's first wartime submarine. And they have brought it up recently, and they found the men inside it and everything else. And they think they know what happened. The window that the commander looked out perhaps got crashed when they hit the Housatonic, and they all drowned. Those were very brave men. Every branch of the service has a horror of belonging to any other thing. I can't imagine flying around in the air where everybody can see you and shoot at you. And I can't begin to imagine being in a submarine under the water. That's a nightmare. But these men, they were the third crew that was lost in the Hunley. They were lost, of course, for 150 years, but the first two crews were lost just by accidents. One time the thing turned over, another time they don't know what happened. They think maybe somebody left the hatch partly open or something. But what happened to them is they had originally designed to use the Hunley towing a bomb on a 100-foot wire, and they would dive under the ship, surface on the other side, pull this bomb along so that it would hit the ship and explode on contact. Well, they found that didn't work well at all, so they decided to put it on a long boom going out from the bow, and they had it there, and that was used in the attack. They hit the ship and it exploded, but it also sank the Hunley, and it sank the Housatonic and the Hunley.
Chesterfield, Virginia. Good afternoon.
Yes, hi, Brian. Hi, Mr. Foote. Nice for you to take my call. I appreciate it. I have a two-part question for Mr. Foote. The first is the old stories about your help as you write, or who edits for you or proofreads. There's a number of tales out there, and I wanted to ask Mr. Foote to comment about the desk that's sitting there, and tell us some more about these ink pens and who helps you with your proofing, or who edits for you, and what are these old stories. The second part of my question deals with what I've read about the preservation of battlefields across the North and South. What big preservation initiatives have you been a part of? What's a success story you could share with us, and what's a not-so-good story? I know, living in Virginia, there was a controversy several years ago in Northern Virginia over Disney World wanting to take battlefield land and put in an amusement park. And the longer you talk, Mr. Foote, the more I'll enjoy it, sir, because I could listen to you for days on end. So, thank you.
Thank you. To get to Disney first, it looked like we were not going to be able to stop them, but we could. And I thought we were rather skillful in that. In the first place, Disney had opened a thing in Europe that wasn't very successful, so they were a little cautious about losing this and that and the other. Then the idea came along that Mickey was going to be associated with desecrating hallowed ground. So that's what really made them back off, I think. But we got together and fought very hard on that. A lot of people went into that fight, and they won it because all of us worked so very hard to save that section of Manassas. Incidentally, it belonged to a kinsman of mine named Foote, who owned part of that land at one time.
Back to this desk, she called up with a series of questions, and we started earlier with the dip pen. And what I wanted you to demonstrate, I don't know if we can get a good close shot of Mr. Foote writing, but you said that you write between 500 and 600 words a day,
right,
with a dip pen on paper. How many words would you write? How many words can you write each time? And demonstrate just for a minute there how that would work.
It's the reason I like writing with a dip pen is it makes me take my time.
Can't really see that, but we can just see your hand. Just put.
I just wrote, it makes me take my time. And you can see it does make me take my time.
And when you would write, how many, the 500 or 600 words would take you how long?
Well, it's writing and rewriting and moving this around and moving that around, and that's the reason I like to write with a pen, where if I want to correct something, I do this instead of taking a typewriter and reversing the drum or having a word processor where I push a key. I don't want anything mechanical between me and the page.
Now, where's that desk from, and how long has it been here?
It's been here ever since we moved in 1966. This is about 2 inches thick here. And I've got it tapered at the edge so it won't look so thick. I had it built in here. Same way with those bookshelves across the room. And this beaver board thing I've always had to put my notes on while I was writing the Civil War.
Jake, as close as we can get to that board up there so that we can see what's on it. How long have what's on there been there?
Oh, a lot of things go down, other things come up. Most of the stuff that's up there has been there. Some stuff has been up there for 40 years. Some others
Show
been
us something that's been up there for 40 years.
Well, the thing that's been up here longest is Bruegel's Fall of the Rebel Angels. You can't see it now. The varnish is darkened on it so much. The Keats Death Mask has been there a long time. But Forrest has been there a long time.
What about some of the notes? Any of those notes up there? I see some quotes
notes
that
having
you got.
to do with a novel I always intended to write called Two Gates to the City that I'm probably not going to do.
See if you can get it right up there on that, as close as we can get, please, to that. There you go. And that's a novel you were going to write?
Yeah, this is the outline of the family and the outline of the thing. But I'm not going to do it.
When did you do the outline?
Oh, I've done that outline and redone that outline. I first started it way back before I started the Civil War. And I dropped it to do the Civil War. And when the war was over, I went back to it and found I couldn't pick it up. I had changed too much.
What are some of the quotes up there? I think you had a Keats quote, or you were quoted about Keats.
There's a Melville quote saying the conflict of conviction spins against the way it drives. There's a quote from George Lucas saying talent is always a rightist deviation. Tate writing to somebody said, we live in a bad age in which we cannot give our best, but no age is good. That's Alan Tate. Then there's a quote in print here from me saying Faulkner had the right idea about mail. He held the envelope up to a light to see if it had a check in it, and if he didn't, he threw it away.
Somewhere I read that you at one time knew Langston Hughes, or you were with him at Walker Percy's house once.
Langston Hughes was in Greenville. He spoke at a colored church there. And Will Percy introduced him. It was funny. Mr. Will introduced him. He was delighted to do it. He respected Hughes as a poet. But Langston Hughes was at that time going through a communist period. And it gave Mr. Will the horrors introducing him. He made a sort of communistic speech to the congregation. I've always thought that was funny.
What other writers in your life have you gotten close to?
Calder Willingham, who's largely forgotten now. He and I were good friends.
Do you ever know Cormac McCarthy? I know you...
No, I've been in the same room with him. I've been a champion of Cormac ever since his first novel came out. I've been preaching the doctrine of Cormac McCarthy ever since that first book, The Orchard Keeper, came out. And he's has begun to get the recognition that he deserves. Heard Harold Bloom in there a while ago on a program on Book Notes saying that Blood Meridian is perhaps the best American novel since Moby Dick, which is quite a compliment.
Why did you like, or why do you like Cormac McCarthy?
The writing. It's the writing. Any book McCarthy writes, the hero is the English language, or the American language, strictly speaking.
Let's go back to the phones. Westerville, Oklahoma, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Foote, I'd just like to say that you look much younger than your age. I'm quite surprised that you're 85, and hope that you're around quite a bit longer. I was curious if you have any interest in other wars other than the Civil War. Although I got to say the Civil War is probably my favorite. Possibly even World War II, which you experienced. Thank you.
If I had any other interest in any other war, I would squelch it immediately. I gave my 20 years and I got my discharge. I'm not fighting anymore. I ain't gonna study war no more. I got various offers to write about the Revolution, the Mexican War, various things, but the Civil War was enough for me. That's enough war.
Harrisonburg, Virginia for Shelby Foote. Hello.
Hello. My name is Phoebe Davis, and it's such an honor to speak with you today, Mr. Shelby. My great-great-grandfather enlisted into the Civil War, 4th Regiment of Tennessee in May of '61. In November 25th, he was wounded and captured at Missionary Ridge. My question is, can you tell me about Missionary Ridge and where it's at, and did it have any significance of the war? Thank you again.
It had a huge significance. Missionary Ridge was part of the Battle of Chattanooga. George Thomas's army advanced on Missionary Hill, and to everybody's surprise, not only made it up the ridge, up Missionary Ridge, but chased the Confederate army off of it and into full retreat, and on down into Georgia further. It was the beginning of the end for the Army of Tennessee, although they had the whole Atlanta campaign to fight from then on. But when they lost Chattanooga, it's as if the gateway got knocked off its hinges. It opened the South up to invasion of the kind that Sherman did in the Atlanta campaign. So your great-grandfather took part in a terrible thing that the Army of Tennessee people didn't ever like to look back on. They were routed.
Over here on the bed are all your novels and your work, 6 novels. Which one of those sold the best?
I think maybe Shiloh sold the best. Follow Me Down and Dry Season sold rather well.
Can you buy them all now?
Yeah, they're all in vintage at Random House, except Tournament is published by a small press in Birmingham.
And how about the Civil War series? Is it still selling every year?
It does indeed sell quite well.
Anybody use it in classes in college?
I think so, but I don't know personally. I mean, it's too much to read, for one thing.
Oklahoma City, you're on the air.
Yeah, Dr. Foote, it is indeed a pleasure, sir. I had a photograph that was handed down from my mom that was made in 1912 in Springdale, Arkansas, and it includes 5 gentlemen from the north and 5 gentlemen from the south, but the one in the middle is my great-great-grandfather. And I've researched at Pea Ridge and Prairie Grove, and I've not been able to find anything about what his battle record was. How can I go about doing that?
If you were a Mississippian, I'd send you to the Department of Archives and History, and I'm sure they have such a thing in Arkansas and Missouri, where you could ask them about his war record. If he held enough rank, you could find him in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And it's always, the last volume of that is an index. You could look him up in that. If you found what unit he was in, if you somehow managed to find that out, you could find the history of that unit. You could find a great deal more than you think. It's the best documented war in a certain sense because of that 128-volume record of the War of the Rebellion, and because of the care that the Department of Archives and History, the National Archives and History have done. They've done a wonderful job of preserving things. A man there knew that my great-grandfather had been in it, and he sent me a whole bunch of documents pertaining to him, including his request for a pardon. And they have complete stuff. You'll be surprised how much you can find out once you really get on the trail.
El Paso, Texas, for Shelby Foote. You're next on the air.
Mr. Hood, my favorite general was Hood, and I wondered, what do you think would have happened on the second day if he'd have been allowed to go around the Union left? And secondly, was he treated unfairly later in the war? Is it accurate to say he was incompetent above the division level, or was he just misplaced in the other command in the West?
I wouldn't use the word incompetent, but he did fail as an Army commander.
What was his, let me just ask you, what was his full name?
John Bell Hood. And he replaced Joe Johnston in command of the Army of Tennessee.
And he said the second day of what battle was he talking about?
He's talking about Gettysburg. Longstreet wanted to go around the Union left and hit them in the rear or take up position in that direction to receive attack instead of giving it. And Hood wanted to also, independent of Longstreet. He had done his own scouting and wanted to strike in the Union rear where they then were. Lee said, no, he's there and I'm going to hit him, and he wouldn't listen to either Longstreet or Hood. Hood made his attack. Longstreet called that day's fighting the best single day's fighting ever done by an army on the face of this earth, and they were good too, Hood's men especially. Hood was wounded there. That's where he lost the use of one of his arms.
San Diego, go ahead please. You're on with Shelby Foote.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Hi. I'm calling regarding Andrew Johnson. I've heard you mention Grenville, Tennessee, and I know he was from that area. And I was interested in your perspective as a historian as well as a Southerner regarding Andrew Johnson remaining on the Union side when all the other Southern politicians had resigned and went home. And my quick second question is for my son. I wanted to know is, could you explain the blue background and the stars and the Southern flag and the red and why the colors are the way they are? Thank you, sir.
Johnson was from Greenville, Tennessee. I'm from Greenville, Mississippi. And his Greenville has an E in it, G-R-E-N-E-V-I-L-L-E. Johnson, there's some different opinions about. He appears to have been extremely unskillful as a politician. He couldn't get along with Congress. I'm not sure that anybody could get along with that Congress. But he simply finished out his term, and there wasn't any question of his being nominated for a term because I always felt sorry for him. He was in an almost impossible situation, and he was a highly improbable sort of person himself. He was drunk at the inauguration, totally by accident. He was not a drinking man at all. He took a couple of big drinks of brandy to keep his strength up, and wound up drunk, making a drunken exhibition of himself at the inauguration.
Colors of the flag?
I don't know how to explain any of that, except he wanted to hold on to the red, white, and blue. The Confederate flag is basically the St. Andrew's Cross, and it had 13 stars on it, even though there were only really 11 seceded states. Missouri and Kentucky had stars there without having been officially seceded. You can get some argument about that, particularly in case of Missouri. The flag thing, there were about 6 Confederate flags. I don't know how many they are. The one we're most familiar with is the battle flag, and it has come to represent the Confederacy, and it's not unfair that it should represent the Confederacy. I just regret, as I said earlier, that it's taken to represent things that it did not represent. It's not recognized for representing the things that it did represent. It wouldn't be vilified the way it was if people would look at it the way it was looked at when it was actually flying and representing something, except a bunch of scamps out demonstrating to keep people from having the liberties they deserve.
If you've just joined us, we're in Memphis, Tennessee, in the middle of the city with Shelby Foote in his bedroom where he's written quite a few words, read, and also, do you listen to music in this room too?
Yeah, music is a great thing in my life. It means a great deal to me, particularly Beethoven, Mozart, the rest of them.
Have you studied those composers as much as you've studied the Civil War?
No, nothing like as much, but I did find out something. Learning to read a score is a tremendous help to somebody, particularly if they have not superb hearing. When I look at a score of a quartet, for instance, my eye will tell me, my God, look what the viola's doing. And then my ear will hear it. But music meant a great deal to me all my life.
I noticed on the board there in front of your desk, there's a list of composers.
Right. That was to get straight in my mind the order that they were in.
Order of birth or order that they did their works?
It's the span of their lifetime.
The years they lived.
It starts with Sibelius, Roussel, Ravel, and Milhaud. And it goes down to Tippett and Shostakovich in Britain. And I just wanted to get it straight in my mind, the order that they occurred.
North Charleston, South Carolina, you're on the air.
Yes, Dr. Foote, I would like to ask you some questions about the history of the state of West Virginia. They didn't become actually a state of the Union until 1863, and most of southwestern Virginia, which it was called during the first part of the war, you had units in the Confederacy, including the 45th Battalion of Virginia Infantry, which my great-grandfather fought in. And I also found Colonel George S. Patton, basically the grandfather of the World War II general, also fought for the Confederacy in the Virginia 22nd Infantry. Have you ever did any research on this area, sir?
Yes, some. Lincoln defended it. West Virginia, in effect, seceded from the Confederacy. And they said to Lincoln, I thought you were opposed to secession. And he said, well, secession for the Constitution is different from secession against the Constitution. You mentioned Patton's grandfather. In the movie Patton, he stands in front of this huge American flag and says, we Americans have never lost a war. Well, believe me, his grandfather lost a war pretty thoroughly. He was in the Army of Northern Virginia. One of the distinguishing things, he saved the Greenbrier from being burned down by Union forces coming through there by driving them back. Patton is an interesting man to study about. He's a man absolutely entranced with military things of all kinds, military history, especially Roman history.
We have about 45 minutes left with Shelby Foote on our in-depth series on Book TV as we take a call from Vinyl Haven, Maine. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. I've been studying the Civil War for quite a while now, and I feel that the high water mark of the Confederacy was at Sharpsburg rather than at Gettysburg. It seems to me after Sharpsburg it kind of went downhill from there. I was wondering what your opinion was of that.
Where is he talking about?
He's talking about the Battle of Sharpsburg, in which the South lost, really. At least they defeated it. They retreated after it was over. I don't think they're wrong in saying Gettysburg was a high water mark. It was the furthest north that penetrated with a major army. It was a critical time of the war, and it certainly was downhill after that, especially since it's combined with the fall of Vicksburg in the west, which is ignored too much. The last day of the Battle of Gettysburg was the day before Vicksburg surrendered. Vicksburg surrendered on the 4th of July, and Lee retreated on the 4th of July. And it's often mentioned as the high point of Confederate hopes. And I don't think that's a misstatement, really, of fact. I don't like pointing out high points and low points and all that. But I think in this case, it's not unfair to say that Gettysburg is the high point, even though they fell off from that high point. It was indeed a high point.
Today's program is being produced by Richard Hall and directed by Maurice Haynes. We take a call from Peoria Heights, Illinois. You're on with Shelby Foote. Go ahead, please.
Yes. This is Sharon Atterbury, and I wanted to ask about, there's a location in Memphis. I was just down there last week doing research on a book I'm writing about a lady who was a Civil War nurse from Peoria, Illinois. Her name is Lizzie Aiken. She was known as Aunt Lizzie to the nurses. I went up on Main Street, at the corner of Main Street and Jefferson. There's a very old building up there, and it says Lowenstein's on the top of it. And I read in a book at the Pink Palace Museum that Mr. Lowenstein came to Memphis in 1855 and opened his store in 1861. Now, was this part of the Irving Block prison, or was that in front of where Irving Block was? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. I don't know well enough the geography down there as to the age of different buildings, and I don't think any part of that prison is left. Lowenstein's, of course, was a department store. Was very active here for a long time. The yellow fever thing in Memphis is almost as interesting as the Civil War. They were devastated here. Memphis went out of existence, became the taxing district of Shelby County. There were so many deaths from yellow fever here, and the cemeteries are overflowing with people from 1878 and 1893. Yellow fever was a very real thing in this part of the country.
San Diego, California, for Shelby Foote. Hello.
Dr. Foote, thank you very much for taking my call this morning. I've always been a great admirer of yours. I'm a retired naval officer and a graduate of the National War College, where we studied the Civil War rather extensively. And I've always been intrigued by the discussion of lack of follow-up at Gettysburg and other places. Meade's lack of follow-up at Gettysburg, McClellan's lack of follow-up at Antietam. In McClellan's case, despite his lack of audacity, and in Meade's case, despite the momentum in his favor, I've always felt that the apparent lack of motivation to follow up tactical advantages in the Civil War could have been due in some part, if not large part, to simply the feeling of enough is enough, where the respect for one another as countrymen simply overcame the bloodlust, and that the idea of annihilation gave way to a level of compassion that simply demanded the victor allow the vanquished to leave the field without further loss of life. Could you comment on that, please?
I think that you are too hopeful of the goodness of man in your assigning the reasons for no follow-up. To my mind, the real reason for no follow-up from First Manassas or Bull Run right on through up until the very end, the winner of a battle, whether it was Gettysburg or Fredericksburg or Manassas, first or second, or Sharpsburg or any of the rest of them, the winner was as exhausted as the loser. Those battles absolutely exhausted both sides. One of them had barely enough strength to crawl away. The other didn't have enough strength to follow up, and they certainly didn't want any more fighting after 3 days of Gettysburg. I have never blamed Meade for not doing what Lincoln expected. He said we had the enemy in our hand, and Meade wouldn't close his hand. Meade couldn't close his hand. He was too tired to close his hand. That war was so hard on the people who fought it. Just begin with a mini ball, as it's called. If you know a 50 caliber machine gun bullet, this is larger than a 50 caliber machine gun bullet. It's made of soft lead. When it hits bone, it just scatters bone all over hill and gone. It is a horrendous weapon. And for men to stand up under that kind of fire, and then when one side starts running, to expect them to be able to run after them is too much. The winner, as I said to start with, was as exhausted as the loser after the battle was over.
You mentioned Gettysburg again. Is my memory correct that you took Jimmy Carter to Gettysburg as a guide?
I took him there. He enjoyed it very much.
What year?
I've forgotten what year it was.
Before or after his presidency?
He was president at the time.
He was.
We stayed at Camp David and went from there. But he had a very likable thing about it. He kept saying, "Where were the Georgia troops? Where were the Georgia troops?" I like that in Jimmy Carter.
That was before your fame that was brought about by the Ken Burns series.
Right.
How did they find you to do that at that time?
I guess because there was some respect for my 3-volume war, which had been written by then.
How interested was he in the war?
Very much, very much. He was interested in it in the first place because he's a Georgian, his people were in it. Jimmy Carter is such a likable person anyhow, but his fondness for the Civil War is very attractive in him. It's as if he wants to understand America, in part by understanding the Civil War.
Also, the Winston Churchill back in the early 1900s came over and went around the battlefields. Did you ever study that?
Yeah, I've studied what Churchill had to say. He said the classic thing that's often quoted. He said it's the last of the old romantic wars and the first of the new wars, all combined in one. That's quite true. The weapons had outstripped the tactics. And that's another reason the casualties were so heavy. The tactics that Napoleon fought by, or the British Army up to that point, had been a muzzle-loading musket with an effective range of about 30 yards, so that you weren't supposed to drop men at 200 yards with this rifle Springfield, which you certainly could do. A good marksman could get off 4 rounds a minute, and believe me, he knew how to shoot that thing.
Mesa, Arizona for Shelby Foote. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to speak to you, Dr. Foote. I have 2 grandfathers who fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. One is R.S. Dooley, 35th Mississippi Infantry, and the other one is Colonel Hayes of the what's his name's cavalry. I've forgotten. I've had some success in tracing the Dooley, but I haven't had much success in tracing Hayes. And he comes from up in northern Mississippi, or just over the Tennessee line. What historical source would you go to for something like that?
I would go to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. They have a pretty full roster of all the Mississippians in it. But since you're not sure which of the line he was on or what unit he was in, that's a good starting place. Find out what unit he was in, and then you'll be able to trace him with facility. That's what you should do. You should get in touch. Get his full name if you can, and his unit if you possibly can, and then they'll take it from there.
Oceanside, California, you're next.
Hello, Mr. Foote. What a privilege C-SPAN is allowing me today. You know, when you were narrating the one of the sequences of Burns's episodes of the Civil War, there were ladies in the room that said if you were there, they would just kiss you to death. But what I really wanted to know was, in one sequence you mentioned that there was a General Pemberton. And since that's in my line of heritage, I was curious about it, as it was never mentioned again except that he was sent south. And I was just curious as if you could give me any information.
General Pemberton was from Pennsylvania. He was an artilleryman originally, and was a lieutenant colonel when he left the Union Army and joined the Confederate Army. Incidentally, he had a Southern wife, which is the reason he went south. He had 2 brothers who stayed and fought with the North. He was in command, of course, at Vicksburg during the siege and during the campaign against Grant. He was dependent on Joe Johnson coming to his rescue, which didn't happen. And Pemberton is a very sympathetic character to read about. A very likable man in many ways. If you're ever in Vicksburg, you ought to go where his headquarters was and learn more about him. And the more you learn about him, the more likable he gets.
Is it Ty Valley, Oklahoma?
Yes. Yes, it is.
You're on the air.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm calling from a very small, isolated community in Oklahoma, southern Oklahoma, and I want to thank Mr. Foote for allowing us to see his bedroom, and I especially enjoyed his comments on writers. I also am a great reader, and I think it connects us to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Whenever we ask the questions about writers, people seem to like those. Your story about the dip pen and 500 to 600 words a day and nobody edits you, have you ever run into anybody else that has the same kind of thing? You always...
You can't make any rules, whatever, or speculations even about writers. There's differences, chairs. You know, every writer's different from every other.
Do you have another writer that you've heard a story about how he or she goes about writing that you've always found interesting?
There's a good contrast between Walker Percy and me. When I'm going to write a novel, I write a pretty full outline. I know exactly how it's going to happen. The actual writing comes later. Walker never makes an outline. He said if I knew what was going to happen next, I wouldn't be interested in writing it. Of course, that's not really true, but it's partly true.
How about William Faulkner? How did he write?
Nobody knows exactly how Faulkner writes. Faulkner only said that he said, I don't write in hot weather. That's the only thing I've ever heard Faulkner say.
You said earlier in the program that you have one of the best collections of Faulkner books over here on the...
I do.
How do you know that, and what does that mean?
Because I'm familiar with the Faulkner bibliography, and there's nothing of any big importance that I don't have over there except a Marble Fawn, his first book poem.
Now, do any of those have signatures on them?
Yeah, he signed the Hamlet for me.
Next call, North Little Rock, Arkansas. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Dr. Foote. Thank you so much, and I am truly enjoying this program. It's just so fascinating. I consider myself a little Southern belle and a very proud Southerner in every sense of the word. And I've got a couple of questions. One of those is, what role did the women of the South play during this horrendous Civil War? And also, what is your favorite part, your favorite event of the Civil War? What represents everything about the Civil War? Thank you so much.
There's no way I could sum up my favorite event or single out anything, but the women of the South are a very interesting thing. They had to survive something that people don't appreciate. The blockade was enormously effective in little ways. You couldn't get needles, for instance, to sew with. You couldn't get nails to hold your house together. They were concentrating on getting things like bullets and swords and guns and things. But these little things that women wanted and meant so much to them that as they found out when they couldn't get them anymore, that they were indeed something to put up with it. There was a northern soldier down there, a northern captain. His company went through the place, and they were running around catching the chickens, wringing their necks and plucking them and cooking them. And the mistress of the house said, "This is outrage. Why don't you stop this?" And the man said, you Southern women, if it weren't for you, the men would all come home. They know they can't come home. You wouldn't let them come home. And you want to sing the Bonnie Blue Flag and everything else and get so mad if somebody gets your chickens. But you're killing our men, and we're killing your men. You can stop worrying about chickens. We're going to eat them.
Annandale, Virginia, you're on with Shelby Foote.
Thank you for taking my call, Dr. Foote. I'm a big fan. I have requests for some observations. This summer I passed through Fort Riley, Kansas, and visited the Cavalry Museum and saw a statue there dedicated to the over 1 million horses and mules that were lost during the Civil War. I wonder if you could comment on the difficulty of providing support and logistics to both armies. I have a second question. I'd like your opinion on something. My Uncle Joe was an officer with the 82nd Airborne in World War II, and he once told my father that if he could put together an ideal infantry unit, it would be Southern boys and Mexican boys from the Southwest. He said they were very tough. He said they were self-reliant and usually could shoot and didn't complain much about hardships. I'd appreciate your opinions on that. Thank you.
Harvey Hill, another one of my favorite Confederate officers, said that if he could have an army that had Northern artillery and Southern infantry, he would have an army that the world has never seen. You get these things. I had an interesting experience in the Second World War. I had command of some kids. They were really 18, 19 years old, and all from Mississippi and Alabama. And a good friend of mine in the same battalion had a company. It was all New York boys. And we sat in the first 13 weeks of training. And my boys had to memorize the general orders. The 2 or 3 of them couldn't read, let alone memorize. So we had this time, and his boys just zipped right through that. Then we had close order drill, and his boys caught on to that real fast, and mine couldn't see much sense to this close order drill business. So his battery was much better than mine in every measurable way. Then we went into the field for our first maneuver. His all came down with colds and God knows what else, and mine were happy as larks out in the field where they'd spent all their lives up till then. But the interesting thing is, after they'd all been in about 3 months, there wasn't any difference in the 2 batteries. His was just as good as mine. Mine was just as good as his. That's the first thing that the Army does, is they make you a soldier. The Marines do a superb job of it. They spend 2 or 3 weeks tearing you down, making you nothing, and then spend 2 or 3 months making you a Marine. And it works. It doesn't make any difference where you came from.
On November 17th, you will be 85 years old. Did you think you'd live that long?
No, I like so many writers, Faulkner, for instance, I thought I'd be dead by 40. Certainly, I couldn't imagine being older than 40.
What do you credit the success of living all this long?
Medical science, really. I'm talking about things like stents and aortic thing, all that, sure.
But at 85, you still smoke a pipe all day.
Right. I had this balloon thing in your heart about 12 years ago down at Oshner in New Orleans, and they told me one thing I'd have to do is quit smoking. I'd been smoking cigarettes and a pipe up to then. And I said I would give up the cigarettes, but I wasn't about to give up my pipe. It would be like giving up my identity. And they said, well, all right, if you have to. So I didn't smoke any more cigarettes, but I smoked my pipe 3 times as much.
How many pipes do you think you have in this room?
Oh, I guess 50 or 60.
People give them to you?
Some of them.
Anybody we know give you a pipe?
Trying to think. Nobody you'd know is giving me a pipe.
Dana Point, California. You're on with Shelby Foote. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Foote. Like a comment you made earlier, whenever I'm reading about the Civil War or some of my small excursions into the South where I've looked at some of the battlefields, I get the same anxiousness that you say you felt standing at the Bloody Angle. And I'm curious, when I read some of the battles, and of course I know the outcome ahead of time, I have that advantage, I get so anxious about the lack of intelligence gathering and the ability to get that intelligence to the officers and then act upon that intelligence. And I wonder if you could comment somewhat on the hardships of getting that intelligence to the officers. And in the case of Gettysburg, for instance, General Lee didn't react to it and go around the back. Thank you.
You've touched on something very important. Whether it's true or not, it's often said that the weakest element in American military is its intelligence service. The S2 is most apt to be the least efficient class officer on the staff of the regimental or division commander. The transmission of intelligence is so difficult. We have an American contempt for spying and tale-telling and all that I think somewhat cripples up our ability to function too well. I can remember a time when someone like John Dillinger was a hero to the American people, and those scoundrels were trying to kill him. It's all a very curious and somewhat comical situation like that.
I don't think earlier, did you deal with the 1 million mules and horses earlier with the question?
No, I had thought of that and I'd forgotten it.
True story? Is that?
Horses are a tremendous problem. Feeding them, feed a man, you've got to have 2 or 3 pounds of food a day. feed a horse, you have to have something like 15 pounds of food a day. So that getting that food up to the line is quite a job. The horse situation in the South for the last year of the war was crucial to their being able to for the cavalry to function. The North was superbly mounted at that time, but the South was miserably mounted. The horses were so weak-kneed they couldn't get up to a gallop. There wasn't any bark left on any of the trees in Northern Virginia because the horses were eating it because they had nothing else to eat. It was a real crippling thing that deserves more study than it's had.
We have a little more than 20 minutes to go with Shelby Foote in our 3-hour in-depth program from Memphis here in his bedroom, where he wrote the last of the 3-part series, The Narrative on the Civil War. As we go next to San Antonio, Texas. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good afternoon, sir. It's an honor to talk with you. And I was just wondering, were you aware that the battlefield at Rich Mountain had been preserved, and that to a very large extent that's a result of the Ken Burns television show and your writing? So congratulations on that accomplishment.
Thank you.
Did you know that?
No, I'm not sure what he means by Rich Mountain.
He's not there any longer, so we won't find out.
Well, I don't know which Rich Mountain.
You know, about an hour ago, somebody called you Dr. Foote, and it just kind of caught on. And if I remember right, you just finished 2 years at the University of North Carolina, but in the wall in there, you got a bunch of honorary doctorate degrees.
Right.
You like the sound of that, Dr. Foote?
I'm very protective of my amateur standing, and I'm just barely a mister, and I wish they wouldn't call me doctor.
How many honorary degrees do you have?
8 or 9.
You have a favorite of all of them?
No, that wouldn't be fair. I guess if I had a favorite, it's Chapel Hill, where I went to school for 2 years, and they gave me an honorary degree after I was out.
And did people start calling you doctor after that?
I guess so. But I'm not a doctor, of course. An honorary degree doesn't make you a doctor.
We're going to show your doctorates in a moment. We've got a camera in the next room there on the wall. As we take a call from White Plains, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I hope I'm not asking a duplicate question, but many years ago, and I haven't been able to find it since, I read a reference that Lee, after the war, was asked who was the toughest general he faced, and he said McClellan, to my surprise. Is that a myth? And did he ever tell anybody who he thought was the toughest? And who do you think he might have thought was the most difficult?
He's quoted as saying, someone asked him who's the most capable general he faced as an opponent. And he said, this is a direct quote, McClellan by all odds. Some people have said McClellan was his favorite general because he beat him so regularly. But Lee meant by that McClellan did two things. He was skillful in his knowledge of the war, and he observed the rules of war. Lee regretted very much that civilians were interfered with in the war. He thought professional soldiers or recruited soldiers ought to get out and fight it out, and they ought not bother civilians. A very old-fashioned notion.
Those of you who have just joined us, we haven't talked as much today as we have in the past about Shelby Foote's background, his personal background, but those of you who are interested can go on to booknotes.org and get the transcript from our interview from about 8 years ago, which goes into a lot of detail about Dr. Foote's background. Let's go to Mitchell, Indiana next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Dr. Foote, I was wanting to know, what color would the Louisiana Tiger jacket be?
Ask that again, caller.
What color would the Louisiana Tiger jacket colors be?
What color would the Louisiana Tiger jackets be?
I have absolutely no idea.
Why are you asking that, caller?
Because me and my uncle run a Civil War shop in Mitchell, Indiana, and we're like getting a mannequin ready, and it's going to be a Louisiana Tiger.
Well, Louisiana Tigers is something. They were a good unit. They were mostly from New Orleans. They were largely Italians and Irishmen. They were a fighting unit, all right, but I don't know that they would be any different from any other butternut or gray uniform.
When you hear that somebody has a Civil War shop in Mitchell, Indiana, does that mean anything? Are there a lot of those around the country?
I think so, but I don't have much to do with them. I stay out of all the costumes and mementos.
Again, for those who've just tuned in, you've been in this house since 1966. How long have you been married to Gwen?
For 45 years come September.
She was your third wife.
Right.
And what role has she played over the years?
A tremendous role. She's been the sustainer of my continuing to do this work. Without Gwen to look after me, I don't know how I would have gotten it done.
Well, you know, you read, though, a lot that some writers, their spouses edit, their spouses read the manuscripts.
Yeah.
Does she do any of that?
No. You see movies about writers or pianists or something. Their little wife comes in, comforts them, and helps them with their work. What you tell is, get out here and let me alone. I'm busy while you're working. But Gwen knows that. It doesn't come any news to her that I like to be left alone while I'm writing.
But during those years when you would spend, as you said, maybe 2 months in here, day after day, hour after, the whole day, what was your relationship with your wife during that period?
Well, it didn't keep me from sitting down and having a couple of good drinks of whiskey soon as work was over. We had a life, a social life, a life with each other, like anybody else. It's just like I work perhaps longer hours than most husbands, and I'm around the house, which is very hard on a wife to have the husband around all the time. But that's the condition when you're married to a writer. You have the fellow to put up with all day long.
Alexandria, Virginia, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. I was interested in your comments on Vietnam and also on the amputees. I was 101st Airborne in Vietnam and lost both my legs. And I think one of the things with Vietnam is all the people came from different places and they left at different times, so it sort of interfered somewhat with the camaraderie. But the question I called for was in terms of reparations. You had talked about the number of people who had lost their lives in the war, and to me that seemed like a pretty high price.
It is. I don't think there's any question of reparations, though. They didn't have the standard $10,000 life insurance policy that they had when I was in the Army. God knows what it is now. When I was in the Army, a recruit made $21 a month, and after he'd been in for 3 months, he made $30 a month. But now they get paid noble amounts, or sound to me noble. I really don't know.
When you write, what about the length of the sentence? Do you have a philosophy of that?
Very much so. Sentences should vary in length. You have a long, rambling sentence, and then boom, a short jolt, and a long one, short jolt, and then 3 short jolts. All that is very important in writing. And you may not be aware that it's going on, and it's best you not be aware of it, but it has its effect. A Proustian sentence that wanders and weaves all over the place can be a beautiful thing.
Now, we talked at the beginning that you've read Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust 9 times, at least. But you have over here on the wall a photograph of him, or a picture of some kind. And I don't mean to offend you, but that is not a very nice frame that you've got around. You've got a couple of pieces of
It's a poster. My son sent it to me from Paris.
How long has that been up there?
That's been up there about 10 years. It's taken from it's sort of tilted to balance. That little white thing in the lower quadrant, or the second quadrant there, that's the top of a couch, and it really should be this way. He has his head way on the side, but they straightened him up. But that's a very good picture of him.
You think you would have liked him?
I know I would have liked him. Everybody liked him.
What, he died, 1924 or something
He died in 1922.
22, yeah.
Same time as my father. And he died the day before my 6th birthday.
What? Who introduced you to him?
My mother, I introduced me to him. I got a Random House catalog saying that he had this new 4-volume edition of Proust, and I had read about Proust somewhere, and I got my mother to give it to me for my 17th birthday. It came there about a month before my 17th birthday, and by my 17th birthday, I had read it the first time.
Now, what's over here on your shelf here in your bedroom was purchased when by,
well,
how long have you owned that?
If you're talking about that 4-volume.
4-volume.
I got that in 1934. And the 5-volume one up here, I got 2 years ago from the Modern Library. There's a 3-volume Proust that I don't much like. It's a retranslation. I don't like the new translation as well as the old. It is the old one, but they polished it up, or they call themselves polishing it up.
Edina, Minnesota. You're on with Shelby Foote. Hello.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Lamb. Mr. Foote, I have an observation and then a question or two, and my observation may be misguided, but I hope you will at least comment on it for me. I don't see you so much as an historian as I see you as a storyteller. I don't see you so much as in the tradition of Gibbon as in perhaps the tradition of Homer. And that may betray my own prejudice as maybe a literary person who loves history. But 2 reasons have led me to that, and I've taught it that way. First, your book is not titled a history, it's titled a narrative. And then secondly, I see this wonderful clarity of vision that you have about these heroic characters in an epic story. And like Homer, you're able to treat them with a wonderful balance and appreciation of the great human qualities rather than the northern or southern qualities, the sense of what it means to be a human being, so that when Achilles meets Hector, Homer doesn't distinguish between the nobility of the two. They both have greatness of character. So I wonder, in my questions, if you might comment on your feelings about Homer and whether you feel any influence there. And then a couple of other questions. One, I don't allow my students, at least to bring to class, the Time Life series, which is a beautifully produced series and makes a wonderful historical book with its illustrations in those 14 volumes. But I only allow them the written word. I don't want them distracted by photographs and other things because it would be like illustrating Homer with all kinds of Greek shields and so forth. You are detracting from the poetry. And I believe you are a poet. I hope you'll allow me to say so. I think your words and your love for the language and for Shakespeare and Proust indicate your great poetic talents. And then finally, if there's time, and I apologize for going on so long, but I've been a reader of Walker Percy from his first novel when I was, I guess, maybe in college in 1960 or 61. And I've sensed a great influence of religion, and not specifically religion in the sense of creeds, but of the great metaphysical, philosophical questions in his work. I wonder if you feel that there has been an influence of religion and philosophy in your work. And if that's too personal a question, I apologize for asking it, and please ignore it. But if you can, among the other things, answer those. And thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question to you and Mr. Lamb. Thanks.
Let's go back to the beginning. You said you're a storyteller. You like that?
I thank you for the compliment, especially for the mention of Homer. In the first or second volume, I expressed my debt to the Iliad. The Iliad was my model, and it's very perceptive of you to have seen that. Not many people have seen it. I don't think anybody's written better narrative than Homer wrote, especially in the T.E. Shaw translation. The Lattimore I like very much, but the Shaw translation I like of the Odyssey. I wish he'd lived to translate the Iliad, but the Lattimore translation of the Iliad is practically a Bible with me. We've been talking about my reading of Proust. I've read the Lattimore translation of the Iliad nearly as often as I have the Proust, and I quite consciously took the Iliad as a model in writing this Civil War history.
Now, right above you, right above that fluorescent lamp that you've had for all your life, is the several. It looks like the Holy Bible. It looks like 3 copies. I assume that's
that's a 3-volume Bible.
3-volume Bible, and there's another Bible. What role has religion played in your life?
Not much. I love the Bible, but I have never felt any pull toward religion. Perhaps a shameful thing to say, but I'll just go really crazy and say my life is art rather than religion. In other words, art is my religion. And that's a bad thing to say in many ways, and I certainly don't want anybody to model themselves after me in that regard. But I just never have felt the need for a deep religious thing. It may come.
And in your time with Walker Percy over those 60 years, you used to jab him a little bit about his Catholicism? Was he a convert?
He was a convert, and as enthusiastic as most converts are, especially at the start. And I used to guy him about it some. He put up with it pretty well.
El Paso, Texas, for Shelby Foote. Couple minutes left. Go ahead, please.
Yes. A few years ago, I went through the Vicksburg War Memorial, and I noticed units from Missouri on both sides. And there was a comment made earlier about Missouri, and I wondered if Mr. Foote could tell us what he knows about the state of Missouri in the Civil War.
That's a pretty big subject call on for, but Missouri was fighting the Civil War before anybody else was fighting the Civil War. The Kansas border wars were going on. It was savage, bloody business. Missouri, incidentally, I've been talking about Bedford Forrest all along. Joe Shelby was one hell of a cavalry commander himself. The war in Missouri is intensely interesting to read. There hadn't been enough done about it. There ought to be a lot more.
San Francisco for Shelby Foote. Hello.
Yes, sir. How you doing? I have recently had the privilege of writing a research paper about General Nathan Bedford Forrest. I found his tactical contributions to be amazing in numerous campaigns. Do you feel that his connection with Fort Pillow and after the war, his connection with or involvement with initially with the Ku Klux Klan dampened his legacy, and perhaps he's not as appreciated as a soldier as he should be today? Thank you.
There's no doubt about it. Those two factors have made many people see Forrest as the villain of the Civil War. They should understand a lot better about things. Fort Pillow, for instance, it was Forrest who stopped the killing, not caused it. He's the one who stopped it, made his soldiers stop killing those people, and they were killing them, there's no doubt about it. And he had sent a note ahead of time saying, surrender or I won't accept the consequences. He always sent such notes and demanding of surrender. Fort Pillow is an unhappy thing, but Forrest certainly cannot be blamed for it. It's a good instance I can prove that. Lincoln heard about Fort Pillow, and he wrote to Grant and said, I want this thing thoroughly looked into and examined, and somebody being brought to justice for it. Grant turned it over to Sherman, who made his investigation and made no recommendation at all. If you know anything about Sherman, if he had thought Forrest had anything to do with slaughtering those people, he would have immediately insisted on something being done about it, and he did not.
Can you remember in your 85 years where you had the best moment?
No. I don't deal in best or superlatives.
Biggest accomplishment, most enjoyable
I guess
period?
the day I finished the war, you could call such a time.
Are you happier sitting at that desk writing or doing something else?
Let me tell you what true happiness is in this world. I know what it is. It's when you go to bed at night and put your head on that pillow, looking forward to getting up the next morning to get to this desk. That is happiness. That is true happiness.
Chandler, Arizona for Shelby Foote. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon. I thank C-SPAN and Book Notes for having Mr. Foote on your show. I've been long waiting since this show was first announced. Mr. Foote, I simply love to listen to you speak from the days of Ken Burns' series on the Civil War through today's show. You remind me so much of listening to my grandfather talk when I was a young boy, the stories that he used to tell me. Two questions. Number one, knowing that I love to listen to you speak, have you ever put your voice narratively of your books onto audio cassette? And secondly, I know it's like asking a father with 5 children to pick his best, but do you have one of your books that is closest to your heart or that you enjoy the most? And I'll hang up and listen to your response. Thank you.
Let me take those in order. The Modern Library has cassettes of me reading two sections from the Civil War. One is called The Beleaguered City, about the Vicksburg campaign, and the other one is called Stars in Their Courses, about the Gettysburg campaign. They're both about 300-page books, and they take about, 9 or 10 cassettes. You can get those at any bookstore. And what was the last thing?
Your favorite?
Oh, I don't much. I will tell you one thing on Tuesday, another thing on Thursday. So it's just as well not to tell you anything about favorites.
Have you read a book recently that's new that you enjoyed?
Yeah, let me think what it was. Something I enjoyed a lot. Damn all. I've been reading James Merrill's poetry lately, which I had neglected all this time. And he's a wonderful poet. I think he's our poet of the second half of the 20th century, the way I think about John Crowe Ransom for the first half of the 20th century.
One of the things I notice you say a lot is he's as happy as a colt in clover.
Right.
Do you remember when you first heard that and why you used it?
I think it was a saying all the time. I was talking about when I got to reading and discovered literature. I was happy as a colt in clover, right?
Coolville, Ohio, you're next.
Oh, first, Mr. Foote, I would like to thank you for letting us into your home and answering our questions today. And I had just one question. I hope it's not a repeat. As much joy as, frankly, I've gotten out of reading your narrative, I've probably enjoyed the narration of Stars and Their Courses as much. And I was wondering if you had any plans on doing additional narrations of any of your work.
As I said a minute ago, there's the Beleaguered City, which is the Vicksburg campaign. It's of the same length, in fact, a cassette longer than Stars and Its Courses. But I don't have any plans for myself reading any more of it. The whole thing is in Blackstone and in books on tape. And it's a huge number of cassettes, but they both have it for anybody who wants to listen to it in an automobile or something.
For Shelby Foote, Louisville, Kentucky. Hello.
Yes, I've been a great admirer also. I think you're one of our national treasures, but I'm also an amateur historian on the Civil War, born in Ohio but raised in the South. I have in my possession 7 treasured letters from a great-grandfather, our great-great-great-grandfather. I have 2 in my hand, one written near Fort McAllister on December 25th, 1864, which mentions Sherman, and they're moving on from Savannah to the next city, I forget which. And they're treasures, and they've been passed down to me, and I think they ought to be someplace other than in my desk. Wanted your advice if you held such letters that, name specific locations and generals and so forth. What would you do with them?
The first thing you should do is take them to a real good reproducer. Get good copies made of them. You can go to many of these places and make good copies and get that, and that secures the safety from losing them entirely. Then the original or a copy ought to be in your Department of Archives and History in whatever state you're in. Those things are very important. Sometimes little things in them that seem to matter not at all are very important to historians. It might determine where Stonewall Jackson was at a certain time of day during an important day in his life. So all those things ought to be kept. Many of them are saying, for goodness sakes, send me a blanket, I'm freezing to death, and things like that. But there are surprisingly interesting things to be gotten out of those letters, too.
We're about to take our last call, and I think you'll agree that our callers today have been superb.
Yeah.
56 calls from people who all were serious about this subject and serious about what you've done in your life. Let's go to Daytona, Florida for our last call.
Hello.
Hello, Daytona Beach. You're on the air.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Foote. What an extraordinary day this has been. Thank you very much. I'm calling on behalf of my wife, who has a question for you, and that is, her great-great-grandfather was Claiborne Fox Jackson of Missouri. And she'd like to know more about the circumstances, if you know about them, for his moving the government from Missouri to Marshall, Texas during the war, when he was the governor of Missouri. And do you know if indeed his son was also governor? Thanks again.
I don't know whether his son was governor or not. The removal was progressive. First he had to get out of Missouri into Arkansas. Then he had to get out of Arkansas into Texas as the Union forces advanced on him. He was a very effective, good governor. So your wife can be proud of descent from him. I don't think there's been a biography of him, but he's often mentioned in anything concerning the Trans-Mississippi. Trouble is, the Trans-Mississippi has been woefully neglected in histories of the war. What was going on in Missouri and Arkansas, and also in that part of Louisiana that's over that way, was enormously important and should be studied far more than it has been. The career of Kirby Smith, who was in command of the Trans-Mississippi, is a very interesting one. So there ought to be a lot more study about the Trans-Mississippi.
Thanks also to Jim Clark for all his work for C-SPAN and this project. We'll close on this email as a way kind of thanking your wife, Gwen, for allowing us to come into this place. And it's from Nellie Rook. And she writes, "Dear Sir, it's a pleasure to see you on C-SPAN. My mother and I were on the Delta Queen in the early 90s, and we had the pleasure of meeting you and your wife. Here's her last comment, and I want you to comment on it. What a lovely voice she has."
All I can do is agree with that. Right. People always talk about Southern voices and Mississippi Delta and Memphis voices. It all comes out of our having had what we call colored nurses when we were growing up. We get this from the blacks. That's where it all comes from. Practically everything we got. Some point in my life, by the time I was 21 years old, I realized that every morsel of food I'd ever eaten, every piece of fabric I ever had on my back, every hour of education came out of black labor. It was all that when I was growing up. And there was a woman who raised me named Nellie Lloyd. She meant more to me than my mother or my aunts and uncles put together. It's all the black experience. And I go down to the Delta today, and it breaks my heart to see it. It's like the place isn't there anymore because all the blacks have left. And that's what the Delta was. I was raised in a black society, really. They weren't running it, but they were doing it.
Thank you, Shelby Foote.
Tonight, on Book TV's In-Depth series, Shelby Foote. Writer, playwright, and Civil War historian, Mr. Foote has been a 3-time Guggenheim Fellow, lecturer at the University of Virginia and Memphis State. He is author of Stars in Their Courses, Shiloh, and the Civil War, A Narrative, among others. You can see our interview with Mr.
and a professor of English at New York University. Mr. Bloom is the author of more than 20 books, including Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, The Western Canon, The Book of Jay, and The Anxiety of Influence. This book, How to Read and Why, is published by Scribner, a division of Simon & Schuster. And for more information about the book, go to their website, simonsays.com. Next week on Encore Book Notes, Ben Yagoda talks about his book, Will Rogers, a biography. You can see Encore Book Notes